hush money case will prevent Donald Trump from being president next year.
Yeah, no matter guilt or innocence. All right, guys, I appreciate your conversation, and I'm just going to kind of dive back in here, guys. I've been dialing up some of the shots, and I've been monitoring what's going on. So I just want to reset, and we're going to continue with this conversation. So Nima, don't go anywhere. But I do want to put up the two shots that we're following, one inside the courtroom, a shot we've seen quite a bit, but also high atop there in New York City as we're potentially reaching a verdict in this trial. We are reaching a verdict here. New York City there. I want to put this up high atop as well, New York City. The Trump verdict, the courthouse. You can see just the amount of people down there, the amount of security in lower Manhattan, just about 5 o'clock on the East Coast. So this is two images that we're getting in as well. Stick with us, Nima, right now, but I do want to take us out to our Fox 5 team as Linda Schmidt is on the ground right now. Let's hear her report from just a moment ago on Fox 5 New York as we dive back into everything going on, monitoring the verdict that was reached in this Trump hush money trial.
Latest on this, Linda.
Hi there, Stephen Bianco. Well, the first word that I can tell you here is shocked. Everybody here, and I mean every single person here, shocked that this verdict came down today. Nobody was anticipating this at all. In fact, I had spoken with a judge earlier today who was not connected to this case, but who has been covering it following it very, very closely. And he was telling me that he felt encouraged by the fact that the jury had not reached a verdict yet. And he was also encouraged by the fact that the jury had asked the judge to read back 30 pages of his 55-page instruction to the jury, which he did yesterday, the 55 pages. They asked him today to read back 30 of those pages so they could get more clarity on how to apply the law properly to the charges and the evidence against Donald Trump. And the judge was telling me, he said that signal to him is somebody who is an experienced judge, that it was telling him that this jury was serious about what they were doing, that they wanted to get this job right. They wanted to make sure that they went over this evidence with a fine-tooth comb. And he had expected that the jury would end up reaching a verdict at the very earliest by tomorrow, probably not even until next week. And there were multiple lawyers not associated with this case who told me the exact same thing. So this is a big stunner to everybody. In fact, they have only deliberated for about 8.5 hours. They started the deliberations yesterday. It was 4.5 hours. They came back today. They started deliberating this morning about 11:15. They deliberated for about 2 hours. Then they went to lunch at 1 o'clock from 1 until about 2:15. And then they resumed deliberations after that, again, for a total of about 8.5 hours. Now, one of the things that they did this morning before they started deliberating at 11:15, once again asking the judge to reread his instructions to the jury, which he did, again, 30 pages. They had also asked to have some of the testimony from Michael Cohen and from David Pecker reread to the jury. So court reporters did reread some of their testimony. That testimony dated back to a meeting between Trump, David Pecker, who is the former with the National Enquirer. He used to head the National Enquirer. Between Pecker, Cohen, and Donald Trump, that was in Trump Tower in August of 2015. And in that meeting, David Pecker had, quote, said, quote, "I will be the eyes and ears for the Trump campaign." And what he was doing there is he was promising Trump and Michael Cohen that he would find, if he heard of any negative stories about Trump, he would kill them, and that he would also promote positive stories about Trump in the National Enquirer. Now, two of those stories related, one of them to Stormy Daniels, the porn actress, as well as Karen McDougal, the former Playboy model. Now, again, 8.5 hours of jury deliberations today. Now, I'm taking a look here because one of my colleagues, Morgan Mackay, has been inside the court pretty much every day for this hush money trial. And she sent out some notes, and she was saying that a note was handed down to the judge at about 4 20, because originally about 10 after 4, everybody thought that the jury was going to be excused at 4:30. That was the word that we were given. That did not happen, because it was just a few minutes later, about 10, 15 minutes later, that apparently the judge was handed a note. And then Trump's attorney, Todd Blanche, leaned over to him and was whispering to Trump. And then at that point, there were audible gasps in the courtroom when the verdict was announced. Again, because nobody had anticipated this. She says that Trump was, of course, sitting at the defense table. His arms were crossed in front of him. You know, when you sit, you have your arms crossed. And that around 10 of 5, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg entered the courtroom. So he is in the courtroom now. So there is a verdict. When that verdict is going to be read, we're not sure. That could be read in the next 10 minutes, 20 minutes. We are not sure. Usually once they say that a verdict has been reached, they usually end up announcing what that verdict is within about 30 minutes. They need everybody that's involved with the case, all the pertinent players, to be in the courtroom at the time of that reading. So that could happen at any moment. But this is one of those cases where this is history making. And again, there was a lot of pressure on this jury, I'm sure, for all of them to get this right, because this is now the first president who has not only been indicted in a criminal trial, he has sat at a defense table at a criminal trial, and he is about to hear the verdict in his criminal trial. Now, in the event that he would be found guilty, there would not be a sentencing at this point, because his attorneys would likely appeal. So there would not be a sentencing. In addition to that, it will be the judge who imposes the sentencing, Judge Juan Merchan. Do you guys have any questions for me at this point?
All right, that was very, very interesting, as we're now getting breaking news in here to our newsroom, talking about all the latest, as we are now learning that the former president has been found guilty on all counts there in this hush money trial. Nima Rahmani back here in on live now from Fox. Thank you so much for joining us. We were seeing high atop there, guilty on accounts. You predicted kind of what's going on, but this is an unprecedented. Can you kind of give me a sense of just the ramifications of this?
And a really historic moment that we are seeing a former president dragged into criminal court, being held accountable, being convicted of 34 felony counts by 12 members of the community there in New York. I cannot understate what an important day this is. And there are a lot of folks who believe that Donald Trump has been treated unfairly by our criminal justice system. But I'm an attorney. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I believe that our legal system works. I believe in our jury system. It's the greatest system in the world, and it doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump or Hunter Biden in a week or two. Everyone is bound by the rule of law, and this shows that presidents are not kings, like the U.S. Supreme Court said, and that no matter what happens on the political arena, our legal system works. And today, I'm proud to be an American.
Yeah, and of course, there was reports from our Fox 5 team, Morgan Mackay, inside of that courtroom saying there were audible gasps as well. What do you think maybe the reaction is going to be from people far and wide across this country? Because we are seeing some of these reactions there outside of the courtroom, people cheering, but also probably people mad as well. How aware is the judge of this, and maybe what precautions are now being put in place? Because you can imagine, as this news spreads throughout the United States, spreads throughout the United States and New York as well, maybe what kind of is in place? What is the judge doing about this to kind of make sure everyone knows what's going on, make sure that the rule of law was followed? How are they doing maybe on a grander scale?
Well, hopefully law enforcement across the country is prepared for anything, because we've seen civil unrest with these types of verdicts, and it could be everything from Rodney King to George Floyd to, even January 6th and the Capitol riots. And it doesn't matter what side you're on. There are people that are going to be very happy about this verdict and people that are going to be very upset. I was on our sister network, Fox News, this morning, very early, 5:30 this morning, and I said that this was a good sign for the prosecution, that the jurors were asking for a readback of evidence that was favorable to them, and people thought that, it was biased and political, and I'm just here to talk about the law. So I can't imagine what Trump is going to be saying outside that courtroom. I think he's going to rail against this verdict and this judge like he's continued to do so. I do think he has some arguments on appeal, and I also question the defense's strategy in this case. I think they made many mistakes. I think the most important of which was they told those jurors that they were going to call an accountant from the Trump organization that was going to explain these records. They never called that accountant. They relied on Bob Costello, who frankly was not a good lawyer. He was someone that was disrespectful as a lawyer. And they told the jurors that the business records were actually true, that they were legal expenses pursuant to a retainer agreement. What they should have done is say that these were falsely but innocently and mistakenly categorized as records by someone other than Donald Trump. They should have attacked that criminal intent. They really swung for the fences and they missed badly. Now, on appeal, I think the defense has three major arguments here. The first of which was that this case, the indictment, the charges were too vague. Now, that's an argument that worked previously in Georgia. Judge McAfee there dismissed some of the counts, and that's on appeal. They, of course, are going to argue that the Sandoval hearing was incorrect. And that was the hearing, of course, where Judge Juan Merchan said, if Donald Trump testifies, the Jean Carroll defamation verdicts can come in. The New York civil fraud verdict can come in. The violations of the gag order can come in. I think that is one of the reasons Donald Trump didn't testify. He didn't want to be subject to cross-examination of all those other tangential cases. And the question is, was it a mistake in this case? And I think it was. Donald Trump should have testified now in retrospect. And the third, of course, is something that we discussed yesterday. Judge Juan Merchan said that even though the jurors have to be unanimous, they don't have to be unanimous as to the other crime that was covered up or furthered. So it could be a tax crime, could be a campaign finance violation, could be election fraud. Now, a lot of people have taken issue with that, but that generally tends to be a correct rule of law. And what I've told folks is, imagine a death penalty case. To return a death sentence, jurors have to decide that there are aggravating factors that merit putting someone to death. But they don't necessarily have to agree as to what those aggravating factors are. They can differ as long as they unanimously agree that those factors exist, and that's what's happened here, Andy and Andrew.
All right, thank you so much. And before, Kraft, I bring you in here momentarily because we're hearing reaction from across the country as well. I do want to put up just some of these shots, reaction there, but we are reporting and hearing inside the courtroom that the former president, Donald Trump, did not necessarily react when the verdict was read on guilty on all counts. We're also getting statements in here from a close ally of Trump's, the Speaker, Mike Johnson, saying in a statement about this guilty verdict, saying today is a shameful day in American history. Democrats cheered as they convicted the leader of the opposing party on ridiculous charges predicated on the testimony of a disbarred convicted felon. This was a purely political exercise, not a legal one. The weaponization of our justice system has been a hallmark of the Biden administration, and the decision today is further evidence that Democrats will stop at nothing to silence dissent and crush their political opponents. The American people see this as lawfare, and they know it is wrong and dangerous. President Trump will rightfully appeal this absurd verdict, and he will win. So we're also just getting this shot, potentially the motorcade. We'll monitor it as he walks outside of this courthouse. Also reaction from Don Jr. on social media. Guilty on all counts, the Democrats have succeeded in their years-long attempt to turn America into a third world. Not an expletive there. The November 5th is a chance to save it. So you can hear just some of the language from different people, including the son there of the former president, guilty on all counts. Let's continue here on Live Now from Fox. I'm going to bring Andrew Kraft into the conversation because I know he has a lot on his mind. Kraft, any questions right now top of mind for Nima as we learn all this news? We hear the reaction from all aisles of the spectrum.
So, yeah, I just want to reiterate, too, what the charges were, these 34 counts. Falsifying business records in the first degree, and Nima has done a great job of explaining that these are Class E felonies. But Nima, you were mentioning possible mistakes by the defense. In hindsight, the defense not calling more witnesses, including their own client, was that seen, or is that going to be seen as overconfidence on their part? This was a smart jury. You and I have talked about this. Two lawyers on that jury, this jury based in New York here. What are some of the recriminations? What are some of the lessons learned if you're Todd Blanche and his defense team, or was the deck stacked against you from the get-go?
I don't know if this was necessarily a winnable case, but the defense did itself no favors. You cannot lose credibility with your jurors. You cannot overpromise and underdeliver. If you say a witness is going to testify, you better put that witness on the stand. I'm sure the jurors remember that, because I was thinking that this case was going to be an accountant that was going to be a fall guy or girl, and that was going to explain those records. That didn't happen. The defense made this case solely about Michael Cohen. And we've talked about how terrible of a witness is, how unlikable he is, how not credible he is. But the prosecution did a good job of corroborating that testimony with folks like David Pecker, who the jurors believed. That recording related to Karen McDougal, Weisselberg's notes, they brought out all those bad facts about Cohen in their case in chief on direct. The state did, and really took the wind out of the defense's sails. So they needed to put on more witnesses. They needed to put on better witnesses. And Donald Trump should have testified. Huge mistake by him not doing so.
You know, we are getting so many of these incredible scenes from around the courthouse. So many Trump opponents, so many Trump supporters are coming out there in Lower Manhattan to just watch the spectacle. I just want to take the viewers back to last March. This was the first indictment secured against former President Trump out of the 4 that he faces right now. We have a resolution on the first one. Last March, he came to New York City. He was arraigned in a courtroom. The district attorney who brought the case, Alvin Bragg, was there in the courtroom. He was there in the courtroom also yesterday. I'm not entirely sure if we're going to hear from Alvin Bragg and his team, possibly a little bit later on. We don't know that just yet, but I would expect we're going to hear from the prosecution about their reaction here. And this was the political dynamics at play, Nima and Andy. And you remember this, and the viewers know this. There was a paradox at play. Each time Donald Trump was indicted on criminal charges, felonies, and misdemeanors, his support in the polls would rise. And so many of his even supporters and detractors alike could not, get a sense of why this was happening. And now Donald Trump is a convicted felon going into the summer, going into the convention there in Milwaukee in August. And so I just have to ask, what limitations or inhibitions on Donald Trump, the person, will he have now that he is a convicted felon when it comes to, will he be able to even vote for himself in the state of Florida? Are there going to be prohibitions on his person now that he is a convicted felon? You said, Nima, he's not going to be remanded into custody, but he is going to go throughout the entire campaign season now with that moniker. And we might see, as we have seen, his support only grow after this, but it could have the adverse effect. If you're a convicted felon, and even you have the Trump effect where your support has grown with these indictments, this is new territory because now it is official, and we'll just have to wait and see how his support either grows or degrades.
All right, let me cut you off real quick because we see the former president now walking up to the cameras. Let's just listen into what he has to say after being found guilty on all of these charges there in New York City.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
All right, you're just listening in there to the former president as he was making remarks after this, somewhat dejected. It didn't go on for more than 2 or 3 minutes there, talking to cameras, didn't answer any questions. And of course, per the Fox pool that the Judge Merchan to the jurors saying they were engaged in a very stressful and difficult task, says they were engaged, thanks them for their service, and he tells them they can speak now about the case if they choose. He will meet with them in the jury room. And of course, we also are learning that the sentencing will be July the 11th. So that's the next step of this. And we are getting this live picture outside. This will be the next shot of the motorcade there as we're watching this. And let's bring him back in here. Andrew Kraft, Nima Rahmani, thank you again as we're just watching all of these scenes unfold, certainly historic scenes as well. What do we make of his comments? He didn't speak for a long time, but he did seem somewhat rejected. Is that fair?
Saw the look on his face. He looked quite disappointed, quite dejected there. After now he has been found guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records. And so he walks out of court a convicted felon. The sentencing date I thought was interesting, just weeks before the RNC convention in Milwaukee, and no doubt as former President Trump has done since he debuted on the political stage, coming down the golden escalator in Trump Tower in June of 2015. He spins things to his advantage. No doubt his supporters will be rallying behind him, but I thought it was so interesting. He said the real verdict is November 5th, Election Day, and you see how he is in campaign mode, campaign mindset already. And so you have to imagine the Trump campaign will be fundraising off of this, that they will be going forward into the campaign season, possibly emboldened. We're talking about this paradoxical effect at play here, and that maybe what will be at play. But I wanted to ask Nima, getting back to some of the legal questions at play, will we know who these 12 jurors are eventually? They're now free to talk about the case. Will we know their identities? They're all from Manhattan. Of course, they live and work there. And if so, and I don't mean to be glib about this, if we do know their identities, I mean, will their lives be essentially ruined if they are in the public and we know about them and we know who they are, now that they have rendered this guilty verdict against the former president, against the current Republican presumptive nominee? Do they have a target on their backs?
Potentially, yes, Andrew. There's going to be millions, tens, maybe even more than 100 million people in this country that are upset with this verdict. So there is no question that those jurors may be targets if they choose to disclose their identities. Some may write books and go on tours and go on the talk show circuit, but I expect a lot of them that will want to move on with their lives, not tell anyone that they were a part of this panel, because this is and will continue to be an unpopular verdict for a significant percentage of the American people. Yeah. In answering your previous question before the former president spoke, being a convicted felon, although Donald Trump is an enigma and he may get a bounce in the polls and fundraise, and he may well be president, it may turn off some undecided voters. And we know that this is going to be a close presidential election. And let's not forget, not just him being a felon, let's talk about all the scandalous details that came out in this trial because the defense failed to object to it. Stormy Daniels' testimony was damaging politically to the former president. She's talking about an affair, sexual positions, him not using a condom, Donald Trump and Melania sleeping in separate rooms, really kind of terrible stuff that had nothing to do with the case. And it only came in because the defense failed to do their job, failed to object, even Judge Juan Merchan said, what were you thinking? How could you let this come in? You've waived your objection, and now you're asking for a mistrial.
And I think, Andrew Kraft, you made a good point there with the targets on the back of some of these jurors. If they do decide to come out, speak to the media, talk about what it was like being inside that room on trial for the former president as well. And you hear potentially some of these comments about a book tour, about talking at different things if they do decide and talk about this. Maybe how much fuel is that for Trump to maybe say this trial wasn't legit, that these people came out here just for popularity as well? Is there any truth to that? Is there any legality to that if they come out and a lot of them do go on book tours at all?
Well, there's no question. If the jurors say something inappropriate, let's say they say that they brought outside influences into that jury deliberation room, that's grounds for a new trial. Let's say they say something that was inconsistent with their voir dire, what they told the parties and the judge under oath during jury selection, that may be grounds for a new trial. So if you're the prosecution and you win a case like this, you're hoping, you're begging the jurors not to talk to anyone, because they can only say something that may get this verdict overturned.
Yeah. You know, Nima and Andy, I wanted to bring up too, why, when we were reading the tea leaves for the last 2 days, did so many legal analysts expect there to be a hung jury? Because there was a note, there were 2 notes, they took 10 plus hours of deliberation. In hindsight, I'm just kind of wondering, now that we got unanimous 34 counts, all guilty here, I wonder if we can look back, why did so many legal analysts who follow this so closely thought that it was going to be a hung jury? And we can get into that question in just a moment here. But Nima, while we have you, you talk about hindsight is 2020. What about Judge Juan Merchan? Were there mistakes that he made in this trial? And I want to juxtapose, and we brought Randy Zelen on last night, and I posed the case of the conviction being overturned by the disgraced movie mogul Harvey Weinstein, because in that case, the judge allowed for too much. Do you think we'll see something similar here on appeal, where if it gets to that level, it will be found that Judge Juan Merchan allowed for too much to be said during the trial in the courtroom? Could you see that scenario playing out?
Potentially, yes. Trump has had some success in the appellate courts. First, of course, in the New York civil fraud case, the appellate courts were friendly to him. And you're right, a lot of evidence did come in. Some of it probably shouldn't have. What Stormy Daniels said really was not relevant to whether these business records were false. And the question is, did the defense allow that in, and have they waived their objection? In the Weinstein case, for folks that aren't that familiar with it, the prosecution brought in a lot of prior bad acts evidence. So that's evidence of sexual contact related to other victims, some of which were outside the statute of limitations, to show Weinstein's pattern of luring women to his hotel room, trapping them, and sexually assaulting them. The New York Supreme Court, in a very close decision, 4-3, said that the trial court abused its discretion, violated Weinstein's constitutional rights by doing so, because that evidence wasn't entirely relevant to the case and was prejudicial. And that's why Weinstein is getting a new trial in New York, even though he was convicted and is serving a 26-year sentence based on his conduct here in California.
Yeah,
right.
Nima.
No, go for it, Kraft.
Yeah, Nima, I get 2 questions from friends, families, and viewers throughout the duration of this trial. One, can a convicted felon still be president? You asked and answered that question, I thought, with a really great answer, because it was clarifying. Maybe we can go into that again. The other question that I get as well here is essentially, if Donald Trump is a convicted felon, what happens next on appeal, and what happens next with all the other indictments going forward, some of which are not going to probably take place before the November 5th election here. If you could, how will this factor into Jack Smith's indictments, those 2? How will this factor in to the DA, Fani Willis, down there in Fulton County in Georgia?
Great question. And, Alvin Bragg, even though he had the weakest case of all the four cases, in my opinion, and he brought the case too late, he really did open the door to these other indictments. There was a real hesitation on the part of prosecutors to be the first to charge a former president. Would that open up a political Pandora's box where we're prosecuting our political opponent? So Trump and the Republicans do have a potentially good point when it comes to that. But if you look at the other three cases, Andrew, Trump's defense team has done an outstanding, I would say, masterful job delaying them. Not necessarily on the substance, but procedurally, because we know that delay is Trump's best friend. Just like this case, we said if the jury deliberated through next week, there was a possibility that they would hang. And in those other three cases, if Donald Trump is reelected in November, it is well established that a sitting president can't be prosecuted, and all three of those cases have to be dismissed. The one that's closest to going to trial is the DC election fraud case. It was the second to be filed, and that is stayed or put on hold while the U.S. Supreme Court is deciding presidential immunity. That decision will likely come down at the end of the court's term, probably in July, kind of around the same time of the sentencing. And when that happens, I expect the Supreme Court to send the case back to the lower courts because the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeal, I believe, erroneously ruled that a former president can't avail himself of presidential immunity. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, said that's not the case. Presidential immunity is available for official acts, but not personal ones. So the lower courts need to determine whether Trump's conduct, the fake elector schemes, January 6th, all the events leading up to that were official acts. So I think that case will go down to the lower courts and it will still be put on hold. The Florida case, Judge Eileen Cannon has taken that case off calendar indefinitely. There is no trial date. Obviously, we're talking about classified documents that are subject to the Classified Information Procedures Act. So there are very specific requirements under federal law for disclosing classified information and admitting it at trial. And the parties still haven't worked through that. The judge seems to be in no rush to push that case to trial. I don't think that trial is going to happen in 2024. And Fani Willis, we know, there in Georgia, she was the last to file. She overcharged this case, charged 19 co-defendants. Some of them have pled, but most of them remain. And of course, infamously, she hired her boyfriend as special counsel, requiring his disqualification. That case is now on appeal. And given how late it was filed and how many co-defendants were filed against, and the nature of the special prosecutor in that case and all the litigation and the circus and the sideshow related thereto, I don't think we're anywhere near trial in that case either.
All right, that is a very interesting timeline. That's a good synopsis of those other kind of trials that potentially it could be on. I want to piggyback back off that in just a second as we continue to monitor these feeds. That one of the motorcade there in New York City. We do see another one on the ground, reporters gathering some sound with supporters and detractors. We're also hearing reaction. We heard from Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, but also Jim Jordan, a strong ally, saying the verdict is a travesty of justice. The Manhattan Kangaroo Court shows what happens when our justice system is weaponized by partisan prosecutors as well, in front of a biased judge with an unfair process designed to keep President Trump off the campaign trail and avoid bringing attention to the President Biden's failing radical policies. Americans see through Democrats' lawfare tactics and know President Trump will be vindicated on appeal. So that's a strong ally of the former president there on social media. We heard from Mike Johnson as well, talking about lawfare as well. Those two words are kind of coinciding in both of those. I do want to ask you to piggyback off what you just said about the other trials, but also go back to something you said, that maybe hindsight that Trump should have testified in this case in New York City. He should have taken the stand, even though it was kind of risky and other legal minds say it might not have been a good deal. Can we kind of get into that? Should he have testified, and potentially, based on the fact that he was found guilty now, will he testify in those other trials if they ever come into a courtroom?
I think Trump may have to. And obviously, he has a constitutional right not to testify. And if he does, the entire case comes down to his or her testimony. And this is the same in any criminal case. But I think the jurors needed to hear from someone as to what these business records were all about. And if you're not going to put on someone from the Trump organization, they need to hear it from Trump himself. And if he were to take the stand and say that, even though I signed the checks, even though I am ultimately responsible for everything that happens in my company, I am not the one who personally made these business records. Again, I'm not saying it was going to carry the day, but I think the defense really put up no defense at all, aside from a cross-examination of Michael Cohen. And even really the only substantive witness they put on was to impeach Cohen. They needed to put on something more for the jurors, even one or two to hang their hat on, to attack intent or attack the purpose of the false business records. Because we talked about it, Andrew and I, there was no lesser included. If Trump had taken a stand and said that, yeah, I did it, but I did it to protect Melania from embarrassment. And you heard Hope Hicks tell you that I gathered the newspapers so she wouldn't read about the details of this affair. That may have resonated with some jurors. Ultimately, it was too little, too late for the defense. I think Trump wanted to take the stand. I think his attorneys discouraged them to do so, and I think it was a mistake in this case.
All right, Kraft, I'm going to give you the floor momentarily, but we are getting a statement from the Biden-Harris campaign about this Trump getting found guilty on these 34 counts. I want to put this up from the communications director saying, in New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. So that coming in from the communications director, Michael Tyler, there as we still are monitoring this. Trump's still inside of the courthouse as well. I will pass along the floor one more time to you, Andrew Kraft, because I know you have more questions, but that's just coming in from the Biden-Harris campaign ahead, about 5 months out of this November election, which he said would be the ultimate verdict for this case.
Yeah, and we had been anticipating, there had been reporting to suggest that maybe President Biden would come out in front of cameras to address the verdict. So we have to keep an eye out on that, on whether or not that's going to happen. Of course, that was from the campaign, that statement there. Of course, we know the Biden campaign just a couple of days ago sent out some of their surrogates, the actor Robert De Niro, some of these former U.S. Capitol Police officers who held the line on January 6, 2021 during the Capitol riot. They were front and center. They held a press conference there. So that was interesting to see the Biden campaign at the very tail end of this trial try to be a part of it, or at least go on the defense and make their point known about how they feel about this. So it'll be interesting to see what President Biden on camera's reaction will be. But Nima, going back to some of the questions I've gotten throughout the duration of this trial from family and friends and viewers who say this happened during the 2016 presidential campaign. That's 8 years ago. What about the statute of limitations? Why are we discussing this? Why is there a trial about this now? The feds at the DOJ passed on the charges. When Cy Vance Jr. was DA in Manhattan before Bragg was elected, he passed on the charges here. And so I think a lot of people who might not have been following all the ins and outs of this throughout the, last 8 years are wondering, why did this happen in 2024? Nima.
That's a fair argument, Andrew. It's not a legal defense, but it's really a fairness one. We're talking about charges that are 8 years old. They've been rejected by at least two sets of prosecutors. Or Cy Vance, one of his deputies, Pomerantz, famously wrote the letter, leaked it to the press. So, really, this is a case that should have been filed a long time ago. With respect to the statute of limitations, and we really talked about all these intricacies of New York law, the misdemeanors and how they become felonies, the jury instructions not going back in written form to the jurors. Well, one other interesting thing about New York law is the statute of limitations is told or doesn't run when a criminal defendant is continuously residing out of state. And of course, Trump was in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C., and he was at Mar-a-Lago there in Florida. And that is why the statute of limitations didn't fully run on those felony counts in this case.
All right, that is a very interesting. All right, Nima, stick with us here on Live Now from Fox. I do see our Fox 5 team kind of dive into their coverage as well. I see Morgan McKay on their air, and she was inside of the courtroom relaying notes out, saying that there was an audible gasp inside the courtroom when the verdict was read, although there was no reaction from Donald Trump. I do want to hear from her. I'm going to bring this in here on Live Now from Fox and just have her take to give that sense, the firsthand perspective inside the courtroom. Nima, stick with us. I'm just going to play this out here on Live Now.
Following this, so walk us through your reaction. I guess you have been seeing firsthand the reaction from former President Donald Trump, as well as his team and the prosecution.
Exactly, Stephen, Natasha. So let me walk you through exactly sort of what happened. So around 4:15, the judge came out and said that he's going to be dismissing the jury at around 4:30. Then he came back in at about 4:35, and he said that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone in the courtroom gasped. Some reporters had already started to pack up, were getting ready to leave. So this caught everyone a little bit by surprise. But they said they needed an extra 30 minutes. When the jury came in, everyone was quiet. Trump stared straight ahead. He didn't look at the jury, and he just stared with his arms folded, staring straight ahead. Now, Blanche, his attorney, Todd Blanche, while the verdict was being read, he put his head in his hands a few times throughout the verdict. Then they went through each charge. So there's 34 felony charges that Trump was facing. And this made up the 34 checks and invoices that prosecutors say that Trump falsified in order to provide hush money payments. So pretty much this case boils down to prosecutors say that Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen, paid Stormy Daniels, an adult film star actress, $130,000 to keep quiet about her alleged sexual encounter with Trump ahead of the 2016 election. Now, they say that when he falsely logged these checks and invoices, when he repaid Michael Cohen as legal expenses. Now, the jurors had to do two things to convict Trump. They had to unanimously decide that Trump falsified all 34 business records, so all 34 checks and invoices, and then they say that he did so in order to conceal a second crime, which prosecutors allege was a conspiracy to aid an election by unlawful means. So the judge read out each one of the 34 counts, and the jury convicted him of each one. All 34. They said he was guilty. Then the judge dismissed him, and then they decided to set sentencing to July 11th. His attorney Blanche asked that they push this back to mid or end July, but because Trump has other court obligations right now, he's facing numerous other court trials while this is going on. So the judge decided to set the date to July 11th. Blanche also tried to push back and ask for a mistrial, since he said that Trump's former attorney Michael Cohen, that he lied on the stand, committed perjury, but that motion was denied. So again, all 34 counts Trump was found guilty of. As Trump was leaving the courtroom, he had a very serious expression on his face. He reached back and patted his lawyer, but he looked very upset, actually. And I hadn't really seen that from him throughout this entire trial, but he did look a bit emotional as he left the courtroom. And he stared straight ahead. Usually he makes eyes at reporters. He says different things to them, or he'll make motions. Today, straight ahead. And he left the courtroom. Stephen, Natasha, back to you.
Yeah, Morgan, as you are one of the very few people that have been inside this, watching this firsthand, what was your first reaction? As I'm sure you talked to other people around you when that verdict was reached. Did you have any inclination that it could go one way or the other?
So speaking to a lot of the reporters around me, I felt like we really thought that this verdict was going to be handed down tomorrow. We felt like today was sort of wrapped up. So when that verdict was announced that it was going to be happening, everyone was really surprised. But at the same time, I also think that a lot of people were expecting a conviction because of how ambiguous the second charge that they had to convict him on. So they not only had to convict that he falsified business records, but they also had to say that he did so because he wanted to help his chances in the election, and he did so by unlawful means. Now, the jury didn't have to agree on what unlawful means those were, so it did kind of open it up a little bit to make it easier for the jury to come to a decision altogether. But again, I think there was more of an expectation of a hung jury than a full conviction on all 34 counts, but there was an understanding that if there was a conviction on one, a lot of people guessed it would be a conviction on all 34.
Yeah, no, indeed, Morgan. It certainly was surprising. You sort of touched on what I was going to ask you, too. Obviously, you're surrounded by some of the most seasoned court reporters, court watchers, expecting like exactly what you thought was going to come down with the verdict. But I think you just said it right there, that we thought there was going to be some sort of mixed verdict as opposed to guilty on all 34 was certainly the conventional wisdom going into today.
Exactly. I think a lot of people thought that there was going to be a mix, but it's sort of hard. I mean, if you have 34 checks and invoices, they're all sort of the same thing. There was different parts where they came from. So some were invoices, some came from Trump's trust, some came from his personal account, some he signed, some were logged by other people. So I think a lot of people were just a little confused if they might maybe say, oh, well, the checks that came from him, those we're going to convict him on, but maybe those that were signed by Donald Trump Jr., for example, those maybe wouldn't convict him on. But again, they found him guilty of all 34. They believed that he was behind having, for example, Donald Trump Jr. sign those checks. So I think people were a little bit surprised, but overall, people were just watching the jury so closely as this verdict was read. And a lot of them, they didn't really look at Trump while the verdict was being read. They were sort of darting back and forth between the press a little bit and the judge, but mostly staying focused on the judge. I think they really understood the weight of the assignment. And that is actually one thing I want to add about the jury themselves. They paid so close attention throughout this trial. They took notes throughout the entire trial. They were furiously scribbling. I didn't see any of them really doze off ever during the trial. And there were parts that did get a little bit tedious at times. So I would just say this is probably the most attentive of a jury that I've ever seen at a trial.
Well, all right, Morgan, we appreciate it. And, of course, Donald Trump had plenty to say after that verdict came down ashore.
All right, you're just listening in there. Our Fox 5 team, Morgan McKay, firsthand perspective on everything that went down, as some journalists were even packing up their bags, not expecting a verdict for the day, as it was just about 4:15 when the note was passed down that they had a verdict. It took some time for them to fill out those forms, and then the ultimate found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying those business records. We also know here into the Live Now newsroom that at 6:30 Eastern, Alvin Bragg is expected to make some remarks. We'll take you to those out in full in about 45 or so minutes. We're also monitoring this, a live picture as the former president making his way through the streets of Lower Manhattan. You can see the motorcade, plenty of people along the side waving flags as well. Plenty of supporters there as he will likely go to Trump Tower, but leaving the courthouse here finally after a long day and also being found guilty of these 34 counts, including a felony there in this courthouse. So we're going to continue to monitor this here on Live Now from Fox. We're going to bring in again to the conversation on Live Now. And I also want to reiterate the fact that, Nima, you hit it spot on. The jury was paying attention. The fact that the notes, we don't want to read into anything, but it was certainly spot on. What do you hear from that? Because you've been inside these courtrooms as well, and Morgan is just a reporter. She isn't there day in and day out as much as you are. Can you kind of break down her firsthand perspective and just potentially what happened today inside that courtroom?
Well, Morgan is right, and the jurors obviously took their job seriously. And really, we've been covering this case from the beginning, from jury selection. Andy, Andrew, you and I have been talking about, wow, we have 2 lawyers on the panel. That is surprising. That is not something that you typically see. If you have lawyer jurors, you better make sure they're on your side. So in a case like this, with this political layer, with these really convoluted legal arguments that, frankly, the law is pretty ambiguous there in New York. You're talking about, in furtherance of, or, to cover up these other crimes. Not easy. So when you have those lawyer jurors, they're going to keep the panel on track. They're going to tune out the noise. They're going to be able to sort through these instructions because that's what they're trained to do through years of law school and years as practicing as lawyers. So I think that also helped the prosecution, and I question why the defense, even though they ran out of strikes, did not use strikes on those lawyer jurors. Another mistake that was made here.
You know, Nima, I wanted to bring up with you too. Let's talk about the in furtherance of another crime, because so many legal analysts have described this to me, this novel, creative approach that Bragg has deployed here. They've described it to me as legal jujitsu, legal acrobatics. I want to read this here. So, Trump, he was being charged with a felony because Bragg alleged he falsified business records in furtherance of a separate crime. They say that separate crime is in violation of New York election law, which makes it a crime to promote or prevent the election of any person to a public office by unlawful means. We're talking about the 2016 presidential election here. So to satisfy the unlawful means component here, the DA, Bragg, put forth three possibilities. We've talked about this. One, a federal campaign finance violation. Two, the creation of additional false records. And three, a tax law violation. Do we know which one the jury ultimately decided on? Remember, they did not have to be in unanimity on all three of them, but at least one of them. Do we know that yet?
We don't, Andrew, and we will never know because Judge Juan Merchan said that the jurors don't have to be unanimous. And this was a big deal to Donald Trump himself. And he was posting on social media about it. He was upset. He thought the jurors had to be unanimous on this issue. And it will be an appellate issue. I'm sure the parties briefed it, but we know that Trump will appeal. He has some decent arguments on appeal, and this is going to be one of them.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you mentioned just the vagueness. I think that's something Morgan McKay alluded to, the second part of all these charges. And maybe inside of that jury room, how much of a debate do you think there was? How much debate do you think there is about the different kind of angles, the different forks of these, the second components of this? And maybe how much conversation do they have to be? Do they have to announce that, hey, I'm in favor of this one over this one? Or does it say, hey, I just think one of those consists of it being accurate?
Well, they have to be unanimous that there was this additional crime. And, you know, if it's confusing for me as a 20-plus year lawyer who's handled thousands of cases, I'm sure it was confusing for those jurors, even the lawyer jurors. So, you know, the question is, was the statute vague? Did it give Trump enough notice? That's something that they've argued from the outset, and I think they're going to continue to argue on appeal. You know, with respect to what the jurors were thinking, I really think the question and the readback was telling. It had nothing to do with necessarily the records themselves, whether they were false or not. We didn't hear about all this discussion of whether a verbal retainer is permitted in the state of New York, or did it have to be a written one, and how these were categorized. We're really hearing from Pecker, and Pecker ties Trump to the intent. He's the one that allows us to get in the former president's head, because aside from the recording, and maybe some excerpts from his book and social media posts, we didn't really hear much about Trump's intent aside from those conversations with Pecker. So when I knew the jurors were asking about Pecker, my guess, and it turned out to be right, was that there were jurors that were convinced that the records were false, Trump had the requisite knowledge, and that there was this other crime. And they were using that testimony to convince the holdout jurors. I don't know how many holdout jurors there were yesterday. There were some. I think at the end of the day today, there was one that was on the fence, that was undecided, and that 4:30 time to go home caused him or her to change their mind, and that's why we got that verdict today. The Pecker testimony tied it all together in a nice bow, and I got to give credit to the prosecution for calling him as their first witness. They thought he was their strongest witness at the beginning of the case. And at the very end of the case, it came full circle, and it turned out that they were right. Pecker was the star witness here, and not Michael Cohen.
Yeah. So you're saying, and we've been talking about reading tea leaves, for the last hour and a half here, and maybe that was the tea leaf, the revisiting of the Pecker testimony. You know, Nima, that's so interesting here. You know, a lot of, especially conservative legal commentators throughout the course of this trial have kind of issued a common refrain, Nima. I want you to comment on that. You know, essentially saying, where's the crime? There's no crime here. After today, how does that hold up?
I understand the argument. Having an affair is not unlawful. Covering it up and paying off your mistress is not unlawful. So really it's kind of like getting Al Capone on tax evasion, right? So is this the biggest deal? Probably not. You know, that's why I don't think Trump is going to get any prison time. Now, do I think the D.C. election fraud case is a big deal? Absolutely. If someone's trying to overthrow our democracy. So we'll see what happens in that case, if it ever happens. But I do agree with a lot of the commentators that you're going to charge a former president. Should he have been charged in a case like this 8 years later in the middle of a presidential election? I don't know the answer to that. Turns out that the jurors thought it was a righteous case, but I think the pundits do have a valid point that of all of the things that Donald Trump has done, to get him on this doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Was this a good use of public resources in our time?
Yeah, all right, that is a good point. The timeline, a lot of questions, but of course, likely an appeal coming. I do want to put up, again, another post on social media coming down. This one from the former president on his Truth Social platform. He posts online about this conviction of the 34 counts as well, saying, quote, "This was a disgrace, a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who is corrupt. We will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over." That on Truth Social, not really long-winded, but echoing what he's said time and time again as we watch the motorcade continue to go through Manhattan. I do have to ask you, as we're about to let you go here, Nima, Alvin Bragg coming up in about 30 minutes or so, the DA, what can we expect from him, and how careful does he have to be with his words after this verdict is reached?
I expect to hear a little bit of a victory lap. Now that the case is over, Alvin Bragg obviously wasn't personally litigating this case, but he's the one that gave the green light for this unprecedented prosecution. And I would ask Jack Smith and Fani Willis if they would have had the intestinal fortitude to be the first to charge a former president. I don't know if they would have had it not been for Alvin Bragg. So regardless of the outcome of this case, whether you think these types of prosecutions are righteous or political persecution, I think Alvin Bragg did open a door that will forever be open, and these types of prosecutions may be common going forward. So really the question is, what have we done, and was this all worth it?
All right, Kraft, I think that kind of puts a bow on it. You kind of just talked about, obviously, the historical nature of it. Nima, thank you again. Your insight is so great, so invaluable here on Live Now from Fox. An unprecedented day there. Donald Trump found guilty on those 34 counts in New York. We appreciate your time, as always. Thank you so much for joining us for the better part of an hour.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andrew. I'll see you real soon.
All right, talk to you soon. All right, thank you again, guys, as we will continue on here on Live Now from Fox, just about 6 o'clock on the East Coast, as we will hear from the DA, Alvin Bragg, like you heard from Nima Rahmani. Maybe a victory lap of sorts as they will get into all the developments here. We were learning more reaction from there, but also a live picture high atop the motorcade as we are following it through lower Manhattan outside of the courtroom. Let's take you back out quickly to some of these remarks from the former president immediately following this guilty verdict being read inside that courtroom.
Mr. Trump, what do you have to say to the American people? Mr. Trump, how does it feel to be convicted of felon? Are you worried about going to jail?
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win. Because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
All right, that was those comments quickly, about 2 minutes from the former president after being found guilty on these 34 counts in this hush money trial about falsifying business records. We're also getting some new reaction as the sentencing going to be on July the 11th. This coming in from Don Jr. saying sentencing is 4 days before the GOP convention. They're not even trying to hide the election interference. So a lot of conversation about that, about the timing. Why was this brought up now? Why was it tried right now? So that is certainly at least a conversation that should be had. And we were talking about Nima Rahmani here on Live Now from Fox very, very closely about it all. We're watching the motorcade move through Manhattan here, heading back potentially to Trump Tower, as we've seen over the course of this several weeks. Let's take you right back out, though, to our Fox 5 team. They're covering it on the ground. They have their legal experts in studio. Let's listen into what they have to say.
This is heading towards an appeal. On the same note, the judge in the case also knew this would also be the most scrutinized case potentially of all time and tried to do everything he could to make it appeal-proof.
Yes and no. I think the judge knew because he came from a Democratic background and because Donald Trump was tweeting all of this negative stuff about him that he was preconceived to find him guilty. I think that Judge Merchant did try, but I think there was one objection sustained during closings when Todd Blanche said, you're going to send someone to prison over the word of a professional liar. And Judge Merchant sustained that objection, yelled at the defense attorney in front of the jury, and then gave
you can't do that. As an attorney, you can't do that in front of the jury. You can't let them know what the repercussions of their decision is. You know that.
I've tried hundreds of cases in all of my summations.
But you would know not to do that, right?
I say that. You say that. It's commonplace. You're allowed to say, technically under the law, you can't talk about sentencing, but you say, you're really going to convict this guy, you're going to send him to jail over the word of this person.
But that's sending him to jail. I mean, isn't that the same thing?
Yes,
you know
and
it
no.
is.
Yes and no, but I didn't think that was a good objection.
Okay.
But I think,
let's talk about with the appeals process now, and you're talking about maybe a different team of lawyers. What is something that they have to do this time around that would get this appeal to go through?
Well, they have to file a notice of appeal within 30 days, which I'm sure they will be filing today or tomorrow. And then they're going to have to get all the transcripts from the trial. The transcripts are the minutes from each witness, and they're going to go through every single ruling that was sustained, that was overruled. They're going to scrutinize the jury instructions. They're going to scrutinize the fact that Judge Merchant allowed Stormy Daniels to talk about not using protection during this alleged sexual encounter. Those are all things that were not relevant to this trial. But I think what no one's talking about, which should be at least briefly spoken about, was the road not taken here, the defense not taken. And I think that if Miliana was there, if she was there and she testified and she explained that maybe this...
Melania?
Melania, his wife. Maybe that this payment was made in furtherance of keeping the sanctity of marriage, in furtherance of keeping their family intact, versus to have the American, persuade the American public that something didn't happen. I think that would have been a much better defense than these payments were just made to Michael Cohen for legal fees. I think Michael Cohen could have made these payments in defense of the sanctity of his marriage, to protect his marriage, and not to, you know, make the American people think something that didn't happen happened.
But then we're going into federal election law, and that is very dicey. And you have to be very well versed at federal election law to tell, you know, what's for one and what's for none. So we're going to turn things over now to Linda Schmidt, who's back on the scene there. She's been talking to quite a few people throughout the afternoon, and as this has broken, Arthur Aidala, a former judge, she has the very latest on what's going on there right now.
All right, Linda.
Yeah, hi there, Bianca and Steve. We have attorney Arthur Aidala back with us, thankfully here to do some more talking, because, I mean, your insight, because you've been doing this forever. You work out of this courthouse here. You've been in these courtrooms, so you have a perspective that most people on the planet do not have. So, again, I wanted to ask you, you and I were just talking, do you think the prosecution was surprised by, first of all, the guilty verdict, and second of all, how quickly they reached that guilty verdict?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, just so you know, I was actually in the courtroom, not today, but in the past. And I just wanted to throw a bouquet to the court staff here, because this case was so well organized by the court officers and the clerks and everyone, and it could have been pandemonium, and it wasn't.
It ran very smoothly. I mean, from a journalist point of view and what we had to deal with, it was very smooth.
And there are moments when I'm not proud of what happens here, but as I said, I've kind of grown up here. I'm so proud of the way this courtroom, this courthouse, and New York City handled such a huge event. Do I think the prosecutors were surprised? I think they were very happy last night when they went to sleep and the jurors wanted to hear David Pecker's testimony. That was their best witness. And, you know, and he said, like, I'm friends with Trump. I still consider myself to be a friend with Trump, as opposed to Cohen, who, you know, was throwing daggers at him for years now. So I don't think they were so surprised, especially when the verdict came in relatively quickly. I think they were confident in their case. They did what they needed to do. They obviously prepared. I mean, I think Stormy Daniels was prepared for days. I know Cohen, they said, was prepared for 100 hours. 100 hours is a very long time to be prepared, and he did well. He stayed nice and calm. They always wanted him to lose his temper. He didn't lose his temper, and they got the result that they worked hard for. Let's see, you know, what appellate judge says down the road. Let's see how this affects the world. I mean, and I don't say the world lightly. Let's see how this changes the image of the United States of America in the whole world.
Yeah, you know, you're talking about David Pecker, and again, the former publisher of the National Enquirer, a longtime friend of Donald Trump. He did not have an axe to grind. Like you said, when he testified, he looked right at Trump and he said, I still consider Mr. Trump a friend. It's not like somebody like Cohen, who admitted on the stand that he can't stand Trump, that Trump going to prison was something that he wanted, and it was something that he wanted for himself personally, was to see Donald Trump go to prison. So I guess what you're saying here is that David Pecker, his testimony carried way more weight than Michael Cohen's did. It just happened to corroborate what Michael Cohen was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if we find out weeks or months from now that right now Pecker sent Trump a text saying, hey, man, I'm sorry. Like, I had no choice. Because he was subpoenaed to be here. They made that very clear. And, I mean, look, I think the biggest lie of all of them that Michael Cohen told on the stand was, and he said, it was better for him if Trump is acquitted than if he's convicted, because he's trying to sell books. He's trying to sell a TV show.
He's got a podcast.
He's got a podcast. Obviously, it's better for him. So
okay.
We'll see.
All right. Okay. Back inside to you guys.
Good deal. Arthur, Linda, we appreciate it. Thanks so much. And it's 6 o'clock. We are continuing to follow the breaking news this afternoon, where Donald Trump has been found guilty on all 34 counts in his criminal hush money case.
We have been following this all week long. We've had reporters in and out of the courtroom, and Fox 5's Morgan McKay was live in the courtroom when this all happened. A shocking surprise for you as you were about to be leaving for the day.
You're exactly right, Stephen, Natasha. When the judge announced that the jury had reached a verdict, they would just need an extra 30 minutes. The entire room gasped. Reporters were completely caught off guard when this was announced, because a lot of them thought that this was going to be, they were going to be breaking for court at the end of the day. The announcement came at 4:35. The judge had said that the jury was going to be dismissed at 4:30. So everyone was pretty much on their way out the door. But then the judge said that the jury had reached a verdict. They waited an extra 30 minutes, brought the jury in, and the jury found Trump guilty of all 34 charges. Now, the former president, while this verdict was being read, he folded his arms across his chest and stared straight ahead. Now, his attorney, Todd Blanche, he put his head in his hands a couple times when this verdict was being read. And then afterwards, Trump stood up. He looked a little bit emotional as he left the courtroom, but walked straight ahead without looking at any reporters on either side. Now, sentencing will be July 11th. His attorney, Blanche, asked for this to be either mid or late July, since Trump has a conflicting court schedule. Remember, He is facing numerous other trials at this time. So the judge decided to set the date for July 11th. Now Trump could face anything from probation to house arrest to prison. Now, what's next in all of this? The Manhattan District Attorney, he came in for the actual verdict. He's going to be holding a press conference at 6:30. Now, some media organizations did ask the judge if they could speak to the jury. They asked that a room be set aside for jurors, anyone who wanted to talk to the media, but the judge denied this request. He did say to the jury that if they wanted to speak to media, that they could. However, we just got word that they did all leave in a van the court provided. Now, throughout this entire trial, the jury has remained anonymous. Nobody knows exactly who they are. They were very careful when jury selection began. They only let in around 6 reporters in a jury pool to sit there when jury selection was going on. So not even all the reporters even saw the jury's faces before they were actually chosen. There were also 6 alternates, but they were set aside in a different room while the main 12 jurors deliberated, and that was 7 men and 5 women. So again, this was a very big day. It caught a little bit everyone by surprise. Everyone was sort of expecting this to happen tomorrow and not necessarily today. Reporting live, Steve and Natasha, back to you.
Very well. All right.
All right, we want to thank our partners over there at Fox 5 in New York City. They did hear from the reporter Morgan McKay. She was inside of the courtroom and she was able to detail for us exactly what went down once everyone heard this historic verdict today. Former President Donald Trump found guilty of 34 counts, and this is with his hush money trial. We do have a live look right now outside where the motorcade is now departing from the courthouse, the former president inside one of these vehicles there. But as I mentioned, a very historic, the jury found Trump guilty on all 34 counts. He becomes the first former U.S. president convicted of felony crimes. I'd like to continue on this conversation and bring in now former prosecutor Katie Charleston. Katie, big day today. I just want to get your reactions first. What did you think when you heard the verdict?
Completely shocked. I mean, in one sense, we expected, throughout this trial, we've seen the unfairness that was presented both by the prosecution and the judge. So in some sense, I think that it was expected in New York with a very liberal and biased jury to get this verdict. But also, as a former prosecutor and looking at the evidence that was presented, I'm shocked at the conviction.
So a lot of people shocked by this. And why? Why were you shocked? I mean, what did the prosecution do right then to get this guilty verdict, and what did the defense do wrong at the end of the day?
I think all of the cards aligned for this prosecution. The prosecution was given much more latitude in this case than the defense. The defense was handcuffed as to what evidence they could bring in, even looking at just their witnesses that were excluded. Whereas the prosecution was allowed to bring in salacious and irrelevant and really prejudicial testimony. And the way that the prosecution brought the case really to put on a circus to show that Trump must be guilty because others associated with him were convicted, like Cohen, is really what the show was about. And then this last move by the Judge Merchan, putting together 55 pages of jury instructions and saying, oh, by the way, you can find this underlying crime that the defense wasn't given a chance to address. So I think that just all the cards aligned between the prosecution and the judge to get to this juncture.
All right, Katie, I like that you bring up this topic of Michael Cohen because it's one of the questions that I wanted to ask. And also, we did get a statement from the former president's former attorney. Take a look at this. It says, today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. While it has been a difficult journey for me and my family, the truth always matters. I want to thank my attorneys, Daniel Perry and Joshua Kolb, for their invaluable guidance and support throughout this process. And as you did mention, Michael Cohen already pleading guilty to these charges, something that the prosecution tried to use, and yet it was limited by the judge presiding, Judge Juan Merchan. What do you think of this statement from Cohen?
Look, Michael Cohen came into this bias. He's had it out for former President Trump for years. And I think his goal was going into this trial, not saying what the truth was, but making a story to connect documents that had no proof that President Trump was actually guilty. And so I think it's hilarious that there's this statement out there about accountability and the rule of law when we've just seen a trial that was completely biased and unfair.
Katie, I'd like to talk about what comes next, because now the guilty verdict is in, the sentencing set for July 11th. And I think a lot of people are curious to know what kind of sentence that judge will hand down. Will there be prison time, do you think?
I think it's unlikely. Again, though I'm shocked by this conviction, and it seems like anything goes in this court, so potentially. But I think it more unlikely. It's more likely there will be some sort of probationary period for the former president, and maybe even some house arrest to attempt to keep him out of the public.
Speaking of attempting to keep Trump out of the public, throughout this entire trial, he has been posting vigorously online. He made some statements after appearing in court. So what kind of advice do you think that his attorneys are trying to give him now until that sentencing? Is it possible that statements that he makes from here to then can hurt him more?
After what just happened, I don't think so. I think that President Trump has a right to freedom of speech just like anyone else. And I think that throughout this entire trial, the way that he was gagged and prevented from speaking, even though he did get some jabs in, normally as a prosecutor, as an attorney in general, I would advise my clients to remain silent so that nothing can be used against them. But this was just unjust. And President Trump should be able to say whatever he pleases about what just happened to him in this court.
Okay, Katie, I just want to get your final thoughts then, because as you said, you were surprised by this. I know so many people across the country were surprised. You heard the reporter from Fox 5 in New York saying that there was a gasp in the courtroom when that guilty verdict was read. So any final thoughts about where do you think this can go, or what you're looking forward to next?
Well, really, I'm looking forward to the appeal. As a former prosecutor, I understand the discretion given to prosecutors to charge crimes, to put forth a case. Here, I think that it was used for political motivation, and I think that the buck should stop with the appellate court. And hopefully we'll see that this atrocity that took place today will be reversed.
Katie Charleston, former prosecutor, we appreciate you joining us here at last minute, because of course, not a lot of people were expecting that the jury would already finish deliberations. So yes, an appeal process is going to be happening, and we will make sure to have you on again to continue to discuss this entire situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to stick here with the guilty verdict at Live Now from Fox, because of course it is the big news of the day. And take a look at this. We also have a live camera right now outside of Michael Cohen's apartment. So not really sure if he's going to step out to make some statements. We know that Cohen pled guilty to these charges back when they were first brought up, and he did release this statement. I want to pop it up one more time for you all to see in case you missed it, saying today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. Well, it has been a difficult journey for me and my family. The truth always matters. I want to thank my attorneys, Danya Perry and Joshua Kolb, for their invaluable guidance and support through this process. Stick with us here. We have more to come on this guilty verdict when Live Now from Fox returns. Welcome back. You're watching live now from Fox. We appreciate you sticking with us as we are going wall to wall with our coverage on the guilty verdict against former President Donald Trump. We do have a statement that the former president issued on his Truth social media site. Take a look at this. The Trump campaign saying, quote, "This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial." This statement does go on to say it was quite lengthy. And we're going to work to read you some more from this statement a little later on. But basically, he's pretty much echoing here what he said, the remarks that he made right after he received that guilty verdict outside of that courtroom in New York City. I want to keep on with bringing on more of our legal analyst, trial attorney now, Jeremy Rosenthal, joining me on our program. Jeremy, a big day. So many people shocked by this guilty verdict. So I'd like to know first what your thoughts are.
I mean, I think I'm surprised like everybody else. I was thinking there might be a little longer of a deliberation, but you had 10 hours is not nothing. You had 22 witnesses. You had, I think, over 200 exhibits, almost 5 weeks of trial. We'll hear what the jury has to say in the coming days. But it looks like at the outset, obviously, the prosecution kind of in their whole strategy was what I characterized as a paper cut strategy. They had, again, 22 witnesses. 21 of them were not named Michael Cohen, right? And Donald Trump and his team were not able to really land any square blows against some of the other ones. The whole concept of the prosecution's case was to corroborate Cohen. And so obviously the jury, it sounds like that was an effective strategy. Now we go into a sentencing phase that's set for July the 11th, I think, I'm sure has already been reported. But we'll see what happens here. The judge has a number of things that he can utilize for sentencing. New York State requires by law that a pre-sentence investigation be done. That's an area where the prosecution can file something with the court. Donald Trump's lawyers can file something with the court. And I believe you're going to see that the court officers, the probation department, also has a say in there as well. And we'll see what happens on the 11th.
Before we continue on to see what's going to happen between now and July 11th, of course, there's going to be an appeal also filed by Trump's lawyers. But even before that, let's break down some more of what we had today, because you even just said it. Almost 10 hours of deliberation. That's not a long time, especially for this weeks-long trial. What did the defense do wrong for the jury to come up with this verdict so quickly?
I mean, that you've got to when you defend a case with what you might call a reasonable doubt defense, that's where saying they didn't prove it, they didn't prove it, they didn't prove it. The law says that, and we know inherently that the prosecution has to prove it, but it's got to mean something to the jury. And the way you have to give it some meaning is that you have to give it some context, and you have to inject some alternate theories into the case. So if we're pointing at things and if we're looking at things that the defense didn't do, I didn't really hear in this trial a cogent counter theory. Now, again, the law doesn't require it. The burden doesn't shift, but jurors are people. They're emotional, and they want to hear, okay, the $100 question is, was Michael Cohen lying? The $1 million question is why, right? And I don't know that we heard anything more advanced than maybe some one-liners. They called Michael Cohen the gloat, the greatest liar of all time. I mean, that's sticky stuff and it's decent trial advocacy. But if there was an overarching theory that they had, I guess that didn't really connect. You could argue that Michael Cohen, that this entire thing was a theft scheme by Michael Cohen, right? Michael Cohen felt cheated by Donald Trump. He felt like he had been screwed by him. He felt like he had been owed money. So how does Michael Cohen do it? Well, he constructs this thing where he's going to have a cash payment, set up this sham company, and then extract his money that way, all trying to hide it from Donald Trump because he was trying to steal. That would be a theory. That would be something that the jury could latch onto and sort of grip. So you've got the prosecution in the case that told a cogent tale. We had a campaign in disarray. We had a campaign that was afraid of everything just going completely south in October of 2016. Then they followed the money trail, and then they followed it up with Cohen. So the defense, again, just in the law doesn't require the defense to come up with a counter strategy, a countervailing theory, but you have to inject those alternative theories for the jury to really chew on them in a meaningful way.
You know, something that's so interesting is that the presiding judge, Juan Merchan, he limited so many references when it came to Michael Cohen and his previous guilty pleas. And yet this entire trial, as you just mentioned, was centered around what happened with Michael Cohen. How, please, if you can just break it down for our viewers, explain to us how attorneys were able to get around that and why the judge didn't crack down harder when it came to all of those arguments.
When it comes to Michael Cohen, right, you've got to, when you're the trial judge, you do have to kind of keep things on track, right? And you have to kind of keep the train going in a certain direction. In a case like this, the defense is almost certainly going to put the other guy on trial, right? You're going to put Michael Cohen on trial. When you have a case that has a snitch on it, right, the snitch is the one that goes in trial. And in the closing arguments, the prosecution comes back and they argue, this case is not about Michael Cohen. This case is about Donald Trump. And so what can happen is when you start digging into somebody like Michael Cohen, right? I mean, there's fair and then there's fair. There's his plea to tax fraud. There's pleading guilty to wire fraud. There's pleading guilty to perjury. There's pleading guilty to this case, right? And then you can get on and on and on. And eventually you're talking about his 4th grade dental reports. And the judge may at some point say, okay, we're not going to dig quite that deep, right? Because again, the issue is Donald Trump and the issue is the 34 counts that he's charged with, right? That's the germane part of this. So the trial judge does have a lot of discretion to sort of limit those sort of issues there. And Todd Blanche, the defense lawyer, I mean, he was able to extract out of Michael Cohen that there was theft and that theft was germane to the transaction in this case. Again, if I'm the defense lawyer, that's my argument. Again, because we have to give it the why. The fact that Cohen is just got a terrible reputation, the fact that he stole, again, that's the $100 question. But we got to answer that $1 million question. Why would Michael Cohen construct all of these transactions, do all of these things, and intentionally hide it from the boss? And that was just a theory that I don't know that ever resonated or landed at home for the jury.
We've talked about Michael Cohen, the former president, and also the judge that was assigned to this case. Someone we haven't touched on, though, is Stormy Daniels, who's really at the center of this entire trial. Those payments allegedly made to her, were made to her, and the president convicted in those charges. So where does she fit into this picture? What comes next for her? That's really the question, I guess. Where does she fit? Probably a book deal. Probably some interviews and some FaceTime. I mean, she was a person that I don't know that they needed to call as a witness in this case. And that would go back again, another instance of the judge saying, okay, enough. Because they were, the prosecution's theory was, well, we have to call Stormy Daniels because this is what American voters would have heard, and we have to show the jury what was hidden. I think it was just kind of an excuse for them to sort of spice things up. They had 2 weeks worth of accountants and CPAs and money people, and I mean, you throw a porn star up there, and then they start talking about sex, and the jury perks up, right? And then you have an explosive day or two of court with Stormy Daniels there. But I don't know that it was particularly relevant, and I don't know that it did much of anything. That said, President Trump has consistently denied any kind of relationship with her. I don't think any of us care, and I don't know that the jury cared either. And from a trial advocacy standpoint, again, when we go back to what we call kissing the ugly baby, right? Marrying up to facts that hurt us, that probably would have been a good example for them to come back and say, you know what, okay, fine. You know, we're not going to sit here and just deny.
We're going to kiss that ugly baby, but it doesn't really matter, right? I think that's probably the more effective play. Another good example of, again, kissing the ugly baby, Todd Blanche in opening statements leaned into Donald Trump's reputation for kind of being frugal, right? He said, why would Donald Trump pay 4 times the amount of money for this transaction? We've all heard that he's kind of actually the opposite, right? We've actually heard that he's got the reputation for being kind of tight-fisted. So in that instance, that would be another good example of really kind of leaning in to a bad fact and sort of turning it around for yourself. Again, would have liked to see it a little more on the Stormy Daniels issue. That's where you could have made money. But they were able to attack her. They were able to, I think, score some points with her. They were able to expose, I think, some of the inconsistencies that she said, some of her motivations. I think you're going to see her on a lot of talk shows now. I think she's going to get a book deal, and I think she's going to do a whole lot better than that $130,000 she initially got.
Okay, I want to continue on with a couple of more points, just moving through what's going to be upcoming within the next few weeks. So the appeal process, Trump's attorneys already announcing that he is going to appeal this verdict. What's that going to look like? How long is it going to take? And will it really change anything?
Okay, so the next thing that's going to happen, obviously, are those pre-sentence investigations and those pre-sentence reports. And the judge will take that into consideration, and then the judge will sentence Donald Trump on July the 11th, or maybe he'll just have a hearing that day and then he'll think about it. I know that's the same week of the Republican convention. I don't know if that's gonna play really at all. But then once the conviction becomes final, and it won't become final until Trump is sentenced. Once the judgment is final, that is, then that will trigger Trump's right to appeal. When Trump does appeal, it's going to be a very, very long process. And one thing that is possible, if not likely, is that the judge, 9 out of 10 people who are charged in Manhattan with this similar offense are given probation. So it may very well be that Mr. Trump is given probation in this case, right? Not sentenced to jail, has to do community service or something of like that in lieu of jail. Now, if he is given a prison sentence, he will still be able to file to do an appellate bond, which will allow him to be free while this case goes to while this case is on appeal, and that appeal could be a couple of could take a couple of years. So if Donald Trump is elected president of the United States, his case could still be up on appeal while that is happening, meaning that he would be out and about and running around. So I don't anticipate Mr. Trump being in prison for any part of this year. I think that even if he is sentenced to jail, I think he appeals that, and then that is stayed or paused while he is running for president if he is elected. And then if for whatever reason he's got an active sentence that's there, then that would be in the governor of New York's hands to potentially pardon Donald Trump if he's the president of the United States at that time, maybe for the good of the country if that's what we're facing. But it's obviously uncharted stuff for sure.
It's interesting that this whole trial kind of stems from the 2016 elections and trying to keep it under wraps to make sure that the former president got elected, and yet it's rearing its ugly head now when we're in another election year. And it's interesting that you mentioned this concept that the president could be, sent to prison, not for the time being, but while, let's say, he does take over the Oval Office. I want to pull up a statement from the former president and the Truth Social media page that he has. It says here, the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people, and they know what happened here. And everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing, we didn't do a thing wrong. And it's almost crazy to even think about this, but you mentioned how New York's governor would have to pardon him in the future for the good of the country. What would that even look like? And is it a requirement for New York's governor to pardon him if we were to find ourselves in a situation where he was imprisoned?
No, the governor is not required to pardon him, but that would be the question, right? So let's say Donald Trump is sentenced to jail. Now, again, that could be home confinement. Michael Cohen was given home confinement. And again, for those reasons alone, I don't see Trump actually going to a prison, even if he is given a jail sentence. It would very likely be that would be some type of a home confinement, if you will, and I guess the home could be the White House, right? And they could try to navigate around that, but that would be the real political question, right? Would the governor of the state of New York be willing to do that? Yeah, it's strange questions, strange times, to be sure, with a lot of those things, but legally that's sort of where we are. Now, I'll give you this. From what I understand from the laws in Georgia, for the case that he's going to be facing in Georgia, and again, I don't know that that's going to be happening before the election. The governor of Georgia does not have the power to pardon somebody who is convicted. So if Donald Trump is convicted in Atlanta and is given a jail sentence there, then there's really no way around that. But I do think that that's going to be a question that is going to be asked of the governor if that happens. If Donald Trump is given a probated sentence, if he's put on probation, then you're looking at he's going to be able to be the president. He's going to be able to do what he needs to do. He's going to be able to travel and do all of those things. And a drawback, if you will, to probation for Judge Marchand is this: Judge Marchand issued that gag order, right? And we haven't heard anything about the gag order in about 2 or 3 weeks, but that thing became a power struggle in a football, right? Because Donald Trump was fairly aggressive on his social media in addressing a lot of these things, and in many ways challenging the judge. A lot of people, a lot of the talking heads that I listen to suggested that Trump was doing it on purpose, right? He knows every time if he goes to jail that he raises more campaign funds out of it, right? I'm a lawyer. I don't do politics, but I'm told that you can raise a lot of money apparently by releasing a mugshot. So he's challenging the judge to do that. So I think if Donald Trump is put on probation, does he challenge Judge Marchand? Do we have another power struggle? And does Judge Marchand see that coming? So again, a lot of really interesting questions, but July 11th is when, I don't know if that's the date that they're just going to have a hearing on it and then the judge will take it under advisement, or if that's going to be the date where the jury or where the judge actually sentences him. I will say this: when you are found guilty of a felony, the judge can hold your bond insufficient and take you into custody, which did not happen today, obviously. So sometimes when somebody is found guilty of a felony, they're incarcerated right there on the spot, and then the sentencing happens while they're in the county lockup.
Jeremy Rosenthal, trial attorney. There is still so much to keep an eye out for today. We only got a guilty verdict, which seems like the biggest deal, but still, July 11th, when we're expecting to hear more from the sentencing, an appeal coming up, and so much more to discuss here. But we thank you for your time, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Carell.
All right, remember, stick with us here because we have so much more to get to when it comes to former President Donald Trump, again found guilty on all 34 counts. Take a look at this, a live look out of New York City. We are awaiting for Manhattan's DA Alvin Bragg to step up to the podium and make some remarks after this historic day in the hush money trial of Trump. I want to pull up a tweet from Alvin here. It says, today a jury found Donald J. Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts. So we are awaiting for him to step up there and have some more remarks. We're going to step away here for a quick commercial break. We'll see you back in 2 minutes with much more live coverage on this historic day next. Welcome back. You're watching live now from Fox. We appreciate your viewership on this very busy Thursday. I'm your host, Carl Lahara. At the moment, we are waiting for Manhattan's DA, Alvin Bragg, to step up to the podium and make some remarks. You can see here a live picture that we have from inside of that facility. They're doing some mic checks, so we'll make sure to bring that to you as soon as it gets underway. The big news from today, of course, a jury in former President Donald Trump's hush money trial in New York City has reached a verdict of guilty on all 34 counts. Trump now becomes the first former U.S. president convicted of a felony. I'd like to bring into the conversation now Caroline Elliott, Fox News multimedia reporter. Caroline, you've been outside of the courtroom all day today. What can you tell us?
Well, Carell, at this moment, we're standing by waiting to hear from the district attorney. But out here outside the courthouse, rather, we're still waiting with a lot of protesters, a lot of anti-Trump protesters that are really trying to process what just happened in the last 2 hours here. As you mentioned, Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts. And our courtroom producer told us that as that verdict was being read, Trump just sat there quietly, almost in shock, really showing no emotion whatsoever, almost expressionless as he was listening to that guilty after guilty after guilty with all these counts. Now, moments after that verdict was read, we know that Trump walked into the courtroom hallway, as he's done throughout this trial, and talked with reporters and said that this is a shameful day in America. He says that this case was rigged, the judge was rigged, and he really didn't have a chance at a fair trial in New York. But he told his base that he will keep fighting, and his focus is now on the election.
Trump is guilty! They know who he is. They know who Trump is guilty! Trump is guilty! Trump is guilty! Trump is guilty!
And a great day for justice. A good day for democracy and a great day for justice.
Now, outside the courthouse, as you just heard from some of those anti-Trump supporters, we've seen a lot of protesters outside the courthouse. We've seen people holding signs saying, "Lock him up." We've seen people holding signs saying, "Donald Trump, the felon." So there's a lot of emotions and even some people celebrating this guilty verdict. Carell.
A lot of emotions there, Caroline, indeed. But was it mostly peaceful? I know that so many people are divided really heavily on this issue, but we're not hearing too many reports that a lot of police were out there. What did you think about that crowd?
Well, Carell, as someone who's been here since day one of this trial, I will tell you this is probably the most tense we've seen these crowds since the very beginning. Right after that verdict was read, we know that this entire area was on lockdown. That's actually why I'm not set up in my normal spot inside the press pen right now, because I wasn't able to get there because, again, this entire area was on lockdown. Earlier, maybe shortly an hour or so before that verdict was read, we did see a fight break out between a protester and a Trump supporter in the park behind me. So again, there's been a lot of emotions here, probably the most tense we've seen things since the beginning of this trial. Carell.
Caroline Elliott, Fox News multimedia reporter. We appreciate your time. You stay safe out there, and we'll be checking in with you as we continue to cover this breaking news today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so we are seeing that we still have this live picture, of course, outside of Manhattan in New York City, where the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, he is expected to make some comments in regards to the guilty verdict that former President Donald Trump has received today, a jury finding him guilty in his hush money trial. So yeah, once again, a live look out there from the Manhattan, the district attorney going to be speaking. I want to bring up this tweet from Alvin Bragg. Oh, there he is stepping up to the screen. So let's take a listen. This is live.
Good evening. First and foremost, I want to thank the jury for its service. Jurors perform a fundamental civic duty. Their service is literally the cornerstone of our judicial system. We should all be thankful for the careful attention that this jury paid to the evidence and the law and their time and commitment over these past several weeks. 12 everyday New Yorkers, and of course, our alternates, heard testimony from 22 witnesses, including former and current employees of the defendant, media executives, book publishers, custodians of records, and others. They reviewed call logs, text messages, and emails. They heard recordings. They saw checks and invoices, bank statements, and calendar appointments. This type of white-collar prosecution is core to what we do at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. In the 1930s, District Attorney Thomas Dewey ushered in the era of the modern, independent professional prosecutor. For now nearly 90 years, dedicated professionals in this office have built upon that fine tradition. A major part of our practice during that nearly 90 years has been public integrity work, including cases involving jurists, local and state electeds, public servants, and others. I want to thank this phenomenal prosecution team, embodying the finest traditions of this office: professionalism, integrity, dedication, and service. They are model public servants, and I am proud and humbled to serve side by side with them. The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor. I want to conclude by expressing deep gratitude to the NYPD and the officers of the Office of Court Administration for securing the courthouse, all of our safety, making sure the courthouse and all of the other matters that are important in their own right continued seamlessly. They will continue to be and have always been incredible partners. Thank you.
And do you plan to request a prison sentence? Donald Trump's multiple violations of the gag order that was in place should factor into that request at all?
The judge scheduled a sentencing for July 11th. We will speak in court in that time. He also set a motion schedule. We will speak in our court filings as we've done throughout this proceeding.
Donald Trump has repeatedly targeted you personally and members of your prosecution team. Do you have a response to the former president after this trial is concluded?
I do not.
In February, you decided not to bring a case against Donald Trump. You criticized then. You criticized when you vetted him in March 2023. You were criticized when people really started to understand that case. How do you think of all that now, seeing the results of that? Can you kind of put that in context with your personal history?
I did my job. Our job is to follow the facts and the law without fear or favor. And that's exactly what we did here. And what I feel is just gratitude to work alongside phenomenal public servants who do that each and every day in matters that you all write about and make the press, and in lots of matters that you don't. I did my job. We did our job. Many voices out there. The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken.
Thanks, Mr. Steinglass. Many people said the prosecution was masterful and flawless. Just want to know how you feel at this moment. Sorry.
I'll let you back.
How do you feel?
Mr. Steinglass, I think some of you probably saw him speak for a little bit the other day. So he's done his job, as has this team. And he just told me, tell him how I feel. I think you said that. I will just say enormous gratitude. You know, our system, I talk about the jurors at the beginning of my remarks. We have a phenomenal system. 12 everyday New Yorkers. They listen to the judge's directions. They follow the evidence. You saw them in court every day. They were careful and attentive. And so I feel deep gratitude to work alongside them, to be a part of this system. And I just want to echo that this is what we're doing every single day. I mean, during this trial, just this week, right, ghost gun indictment, Grimaldi's wage theft plea resolution, sex crimes, convictions, all sorts of work that's being done by phenomenal public servants. So we're before you today on this obviously consequential matter, but this is what we do every day. We follow the facts and the law without fear or favor.
If a jail sentence is in the cards, it is likely that Trump and his attorneys would seek a stay on enforcement of that sentence pending appeal. If that were the scenario, would your office object to staying the sentence?
I'm going to let our words in court speak for themselves when we get to the sentencing matter. I'm not going to address hypotheticals. They raise arguments, we'll respond. And I think your question really underscores an important point. This is an active, ongoing matter, right? We have other phases of this going ahead. We will continue to do our speaking about this matter, about issues like that in court.
All right, last one.
From day one, kind of the viability of this case has been questioned in all sorts of media outlets, all over the place, including from the defendant himself. Can you respond to any of that, how you feel now that you've gotten the conviction?
So my response, again, is I did my job. And I think particularly I talked about the history of the office. My personal history, I started as a prosecutor in 2003 in the Public Integrity Unit in the New York State Attorney General's office. I served also in the Public Integrity Unit in the Southern District of New York. These are kind of cases I've done personally, and it's a hallmark of the tradition of this office that I'm proud to lead. And I don't want to go into the whole body of litigation, but we now have a federal court decision ruling on the legal theories. We had a state court decision on the omnibus motions. But most importantly, today we have the most important voice of all, and that's the voice of the jurors. They have spoken. Donald J. Trump has been convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records. Thank you.
District Attorney, your office has been investigating this case since
Are you concerned about retribution if Trump is elected president?
You went to the Supreme Court twice.
All right, Andrew Kraft here now in the anchor chair. We have just listened to Manhattan District Attorney there, Alvin Bragg, speaking on what has been, for his office, a successful day, securing 34 guilty verdicts against former President Donald Trump here. I'm Andrew Kraft. Thank you so much to my colleagues, Karel Lahara and Andy Mack. We're going to guide you through this very historic story going forward throughout the course of the next several hours. We know there's a lot of interest in this story. We're going to be bringing on legal analysts to help us make sense of the ins and outs, legally speaking, of this story. And what happens next? Many of you are probably wondering, you probably have a lot of the same questions that I do. Can Donald Trump still be a candidate or still be president, even though now he's a convicted felon? Why this case now? And so what does this mean for the 2024 race as well here. Those are all my questions. I know you have some of those questions as well. So we're going to be going in and out of some of these live vantage points that we have from on the ground and in the air as well. We have this picture. This is right outside of Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. We also have Sky Fox overhead, courtesy of Fox 5 New York. It looks like they've moved from Lower Manhattan to Midtown over Trump Tower as well. But we do have the Lower Manhattan shot. Take a look at this. Many supporters and detractors of Trump alike there still outside the courthouse. You see there signs like Trump convicted, lock him up, convict Trump there. So this is going to be the dominant story throughout the next several weeks and several months. We are learning a piece of news just now. We heard from the former president on camera only briefly, not even, a minute there. Well, we will hear from him tomorrow morning. He just posted this there on Truth Social. He says, in all caps, press conference tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, Trump Tower Atrium, MAGA 2024. So in the meantime here, as we approach the top of the hour, we've been relying so heavily on our friends, our reporters there stationed live outside the courthouse, including Fox's Caroline Elliott. You just heard from her there. Also, though, our friend Fox's Connor Hansen, he joins me. Connor, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. We've been relying on you so heavily here on Live Now to help us make sense of all the deliberations, of the ins and outs of the trial, the witnesses here. What is the energy like there in Lower Manhattan right now?
Andrew, good to be with you. The tone shifting so rapidly here outside the courtroom and inside from what we've heard from our colleagues who were actually there when that verdict was read. You mentioned it a little bit already, but we've seen protesters, people on both sides, some people celebrating this guilty verdict who have been against Trump this whole time. Others, supporters, a lot of them were here throughout the entire 6 weeks of the trial. There were even some almost confrontations there at first, but things are actually quieting down a little bit outside, at least where we're standing outside the courtroom. What's really interesting here, I don't think most people were expecting the verdict to come this soon. The jurors were only in really for less than 2 full days of deliberation before they came back. And when the court said today that they were going to wrap up at 4:30 our time here, to me that meant that it was going to go at least another day. But then they got the note. They did have a verdict. Our counterparts inside the courtroom told us it went dead silent. Tense moments as they locked down the hallways with police, locked down the outside of the courtroom, waited about 30 minutes before that verdict was read. Guilty on all 34 charges of falsifying business records. Those, of course, are felonies. Now we'll have to wait till sentencing. That'll be July 11th, notably only a few days before the Republican National Convention, and it'll be up to Judge Juan Merchan alone to decide exactly what that sentence will be. And with a felony, that could range anywhere from something like probation to actual jail time, even though that's highly unlikely for a former president. A very historic day here. The first time a former president's been charged with a felony. And as you mentioned, we're going to keep hearing this for a very long time. And you know, Andrew, there's a poll that came out last week that I think is just so interesting leading into this guilty verdict. It'll be interesting to see it again afterwards, but they asked people, you know, if Donald Trump is found guilty in this hush money trial, would you be more likely to vote for him in November? 15% of people said yes. Would you be less likely to vote for him in November? 17%. So will it make no difference? That's 67%. So based on that poll, not moving the needle with a lot of people, but now that the reality's kicked in, it'll be interesting to see that poll again. Obviously, tons of reaction coming in from all sides of this, Andrew.
And you know, Connor, you're so right. One of the key facets of this primary season, and even last year, was when the former president kept getting indicted, now in 4 jurisdictions, convicted in 1. His support, we saw, only grew. And so we'll have to keep an eye out on some of these polls to see whether that sticks, whether that stands, or will there be some type of degradation of support now that he is, in fact, a convicted felon. I'm going to have my eye on that with some polling, later this spring and summer, because that is the uncharted territory we are now in. It was always just a theory before today, right? Right, Connor?
Outside of the indictment. And this is not unusual.
That's right, Andrew. And one thing we know for sure already is that both sides, former President Trump's campaign and President Biden's campaign, they're already fundraising off this. They're already campaigning on this. We even saw a screenshot of Trump's campaign website that gave an error. It was overloaded seemingly. So what does that tell you about how many people are looking at it? We also heard from President Biden's campaign and from President Biden basically saying, we saw today that no one's above the law and the only way to beat Trump will be at the ballot box. There was also a link to donate to his campaign there. So on top of those polls, we'll also have to be watching how much money both sides are really raising after this as we head into this busy summer with conventions and just keep on marching towards November.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the Biden camp, like you said, Connor's already campaigning, or fundraising, I should say, on this announcement, much like the Trump campaign is. Connor, just lastly, for those of our viewers who don't live in New York like you do, if you were out and about in your everyday life before today, were New Yorkers eagerly anticipating this decision? Was everyone talking about it at work, at the bar, at happy hour, with their friends and family? And does that mean, and is that evocative of the very big crowd that we have out there in Lower Manhattan?
Professor, I think you nailed it. Anything I didn't ask you?
I really do think so, Andrew. I mean, honestly, even for me being here so much of this trial, we really didn't know what to expect in terms of a verdict, but people were obviously talking about this. We saw all the time people walking down here just to catch a glimpse of the scene, the sheer scale, all the cameras, all the news crews here this entire time. Just sort of taking the energy. It really is a historic event. And, obviously in such a diverse city, you hear so many different opinions on it. It could be argued that, the city votes more Democratic. That was the complaint of Trump's team about this jury. But, really just diverse opinions as we saw here, groups of people protesting it and groups of people supporting Trump.
All right, Fox's Connor Hansen there live for us in Lower Manhattan. Connor, thanks so much. We'll check in soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right, in the meantime here, we're just getting started as we go into the early evening hours on all coasts here, the East Coast and the West Coast. Like I said, I'm Andrew Kraft. Can't thank Connor Hansen enough there. We do have this not so stable shot here outside of Trump Tower. So we don't necessarily know the movements of the former president. You just see there a lot of Secret Service, a lot of NYPD, no doubt Trump campaign officials outside one of the entrances to Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. If you go a little bit further south, this is still the scene there as well, with many probably members of the press, of course, but also everyday New Yorkers, activists, anti-Trump folks, pro-Trump folks, holding signs, coming out to make their voices heard, exercising their First Amendment rights as they are completely accustomed and allowed to do there. So take a look at, we have a vantage point now of the entire kind of small park there in front of the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. We're getting more and more statements in from the Trump campaign. I want to put this up here. President Trump with this saying, quote, "This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace, and we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country has gone to hell." It's a similar rhetoric that you've heard for 20-plus days throughout the duration of this case here. So let's take our first quick commercial break of this hour. We're going to be in limited break format, but we have a lot of guests coming in from all over, legal analysts, to help us make sense of this historic day. It's a historic day politically speaking. It's a historic day legally speaking. All of that and more in 2 minutes. And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft, and thank you for being with us on what has been a moment in American history no one will forget, a first. That a former American president has now been convicted on felony charges, 34 of them by a guilty verdict there by a jury of his peers in Lower Manhattan. We want to bring into the conversation right now our friend, legal analyst and attorney himself, Matt Timpanek, for some more analysis and context on what happened today. Matt joins me. Matt, thanks for being with us here. You've been following this also closely. I guess my first question to you is this. Has a Pandora's box been opened after this guilty verdict, these guilty verdicts today here? Has a precedent been set?
It depends on who you ask. When you review this case, Donald Trump was indicted by a grand jury. He was tried by a jury of his peers, and that jury rendered a verdict. It's no different than any kind of criminal defendant. There are many people talk about how it was a sham, that's politically motivated, all perfectly valid opinions. But for now, based on what I saw throughout this entire process, you can say that the judge was biased or whatever, but Donald J. Trump received due process, and he was no different than any criminal defendant who came through our criminal justice system.
Okay, no, that's an important distinction to make, but let's talk about, in hindsight here, how history might judge this about the prosecution, the defense, the judge, and we don't have to go very far because the appellate process, I would imagine, will be soon underway here. That has been promised by the Trump defense team. Matt, what's that going to look like, and what grounds do they have on appeal?
So the first thing they're going to appeal is they could do the verdict itself, try to do that immediately. Sentences is set for July 11th on this case. They can also appeal the judgment and sentence of the court, but I don't think they're going to wait that long. I think they're going to try to move for an immediate appeal for the appellate court to kind of set aside or vacate a jury verdict, which would not allow Judge Mersan to actually allow for the defendant to be sentenced. I would think that's pretty unlikely. Under the theory of stare decisis, which is let the decision stand, sure, juries, especially appellate courts, are very, very hesitant to set aside lawful jury verdicts. So if they do, there has to be reversible error.
Yeah. Matt, obviously Lady Justice is blind, but if you're not former President Donald Trump, if you're any other defendant, not as high profile, and you were found guilty on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, what would you be looking at? Realistically speaking.
Realistically speaking, this charge, each one of these convictions carries up to a prison sentence of up to 4 years in prison. We'll first need to make the distinction when people talk about jail and prison. They're not interchangeable. Jail is where you are sent for usually misdemeanors or low-level felonies, and prison is where you are sent for much more serious offenses and felonies or even federal offenses. I definitely don't. I think that in this case, prison might be a more of a stretch here. But a jail sentence followed by probation is certainly very possible. I understand talking about the first-time offender and stuff, but when a judge renders a sentence, they look at the entire facts and the evidence as well as how the defendant conducted himself during trial. The judge is not going to penalize him for going to trial. But remember, Donald J. Trump was sanctioned about approximately 10 times during this case, issued numerous gag orders. So that's something the judge is going to take into account when eventually he renders sentence in this case.
Depending on what that sentence is on July the 11th, it's May 30th. From May 30th to July 11th, depending on what Donald Trump does and says, can Juan Merchan take any of that into account when factoring in this sentence here? Is Donald Trump going to have to be on a very tight leash? Does it even matter what he does in the interim? If so, will it be a factor in the sentencing?
Well, I definitely think that now that he's been found guilty, usually in these types of cases, a defendant is remanded into custody pending sentencing, meaning the defendant is held in jail while sentence is done. That's not the case here with the former president. If he violates the orders set by the judge about what he's allowed to say and what he's not allowed to say, he could potentially have his bond revoked and stay in custody while before his sentence. However, if he continues to follow the terms of his release as Judge Merchan has laid out, he will stay out of custody until July the 11th when he is formally sentenced.
We're looking at these aerial pictures over Trump Tower. We don't necessarily know if the former president himself, will be leaving Trump Tower to go anywhere. We know, though, that this press conference he's going to hold tomorrow morning at 11 will be held there in the Trump Tower atrium. And I just want to remind the viewers, because it's so interesting going back, June 2015, Matt, when he descended the golden escalator, he made his announcement that he's running for president. And here we are some, 9 years later. And so just that political arc, I just thought is so interesting. You know, I'm getting a lot of questions too, Matt, about what is the prohibitive restrictions on Trump now that he is a convicted felon, specifically when it comes to his voting rights. We have this in from some of our Fox producers on his eligibility to vote in this presidential election. So I'm told that as long as Trump is not incarcerated on Election Day, he will be eligible to vote in the election here. So I think that's an interesting question. I was getting it a lot, but I had to get that out there. What say you?
I definitely think that is the case. What sets up an interesting situation is Donald J. Trump is a resident of the state of Florida. The state of Florida doesn't allow convicted felons to vote. And with him, President Trump, being convicted of a felony, it sets up a very interesting conundrum. There are convicted felons who cannot vote in the state of Florida. And does the same apply for the former president because he is, in fact, the former president? I don't know. It's entirely possible he might actually, if he is ineligible to vote in Florida, he might potentially change his registration to New York, which I think might allow him the ability to. It sets up a very, very interesting scenario because most people know that he can still be president as a convicted felon. He can still run for office. He could still be elected president from a jail cell. But it sets up a very interesting situation of whether or not, depending on how the laws are applied, whether he could actually vote in the upcoming presidential election for himself.
Yeah, we were just seeing some kind of scenic shots there in Midtown Manhattan outside of Rockefeller Center, it looked like. So, yeah, those are the laws. One in Florida, a felony conviction in another state makes a person ineligible to vote in Florida only if the conviction would make the person ineligible to vote in the state where the person was convicted. And then, Matt, to your point, in New York, you lose your right to vote while you are in prison for a felony conviction. If you are convicted of a felony and you're released from prison, you can vote. If you're convicted of a felony and your sentence is suspended, you can vote here. You know, it's kind of like the next tranche in this story, Matt. We were all trying as best we could to read the tea leaves about how the jury might come down on this case. Obviously, we know 34 felony counts, all guilty. And now the next part of this, the next phase, how might Judge Juan Merchan sentence the former president of the United States? Because he is a former president of the United States, will that factor into the sentence at all? Or will Merchan not consider that? Or does he have to consider that or not?
I think in this type of situation where you have a former president, the only way to approach sentencing is remember that Lady Justice is blind. It should not matter he's the former president. He's been convicted of a felony. What is, based on the statute and the sentencing guidelines, what is the appropriate sentence? He is a first-time offender. He has no criminal record. These are white-collar offenses. These are non-violent offenses. All of that is weighed against the aggravations. Like, okay, this was done to cover up his involvement in the 2016 election, about how that would have affected his campaign. His conduct during trial, where he was numerous times get sanctioned by the judge by making comments about people, violating gag orders. Those two are weighed against each other. For me, what I can tell you is the most likely scenario is potentially a jail sentence followed by probation. It's very possible that Judge Merchan decides that to simply give him a probation sentence because on the theory that I'm going to allow the voters in November to decide what your sentence is, whether you should be president or not.
Wait, Matt, if I have that correctly, you think there is going to be some jail time?
It's possible. It's definitely, remember, these are felony offenses. These are not misdemeanors. Okay. It's possible, but it's far from certain, like I said. But as I stated earlier, that's probably one of the most likely scenarios, but Also, I would not be surprised if he simply did a probation sentence as well. Okay. But I don't think prison is going to happen here.
All right. So, Matt, let's talk about the other characters in this case. Witnesses, jurors. We've heard from some of them, not the jurors, some of the witnesses. What is the guidance on jury testimony, so to speak, no pun intended? You know, I mean, are they going to speak out about this? I mean, they have the choice. Does it behoove them to do this? I mean, Juan Merchan says you can now talk about it amongst yourself and with people, but should they?
It all depends. A juror has the absolute right, like you stated, not to speak about anything about deliberations. They don't have to talk to anyone. If press calls them, they don't have to answer it. That is an absolute right. However, they also have the absolute right to speak about their experiences. They can talk about what has gone on in the deliberation room. I've had, when I was handled many criminal jury trials, I've had times when jurors have called me to give me feedback into what actually gone on. But most of the time, they don't do anything. They just do the case and they move on. It will all depend on what they want. A lot of jurors are not going to want, given the high publicity of this case, to have their identities known and potentially be the subject of harassment. So if I were to guess, I think these jurors would probably move to have their identity kept secret.
All right, so Matt Timpanek on with me here, Andrew Kraft. It does look like there is some movement in the Trump motorcade. We just, I don't know if we caught this, I caught this briefly. We saw Trump get into the black Suburban there. We don't know where he's going. If maybe some of my producers know, they can tell me, but he's leaving Trump Tower. Not entirely sure where he's going. Of course, he told us as much that this press conference he's holding tomorrow morning will be in the atrium of Trump Tower there in Midtown Manhattan. We have a ground shot as well here. Take a look at this. So the motorcade is leaving. Of course, one of his residences is Trump Tower. There's a lot of campaign folks with him, campaign staff, supporters, many of his Republican acolytes and allies, really kind of flooding social media with messages of support as well here. So if we get a sense of where Trump is going, we'll make sure to bring it to you. I just want to thank Matt Timpanek, as always, for coming on and helping us make sense of this. Matt, thanks so much. Talk soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right, in the meantime here, we do want to take yet another quick commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to kind of reset. If you haven't seen it by now, Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, holding a press conference. Also, if you haven't seen it by now, former President Trump leaving court today after it adjourned with very brief remarks. And then we're going to show you the reaction on social media. So many of his allies and acolytes, like I said, flooding Twitter and Instagram and Facebook with messages of support. We've also heard from the Biden White House and the Biden campaign. So we'll get to all of that. It's a good time to reset. We'll see you in 2 minutes. And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. We're going to keep it moving here with a history-making day. Former President Donald Trump in a lower Manhattan courtroom was found guilty on all 34 counts against him. That was the verdict the jury rendered, all 12 jurors in unanimity on that question here. And so we've been monitoring so much of the reaction. First, though, we want to let you listen and let you watch to how Trump responded to this when he left court today. Let's watch.
Mr. Trump, what do you have to say to the American people? Mr. Trump, how is it going to be evicted felon? Are you worried about going to jail?
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA. And the whole thing, we didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
All right, that was the former president just, about 2 hours ago now, responding to the guilty verdicts against him. He's now a convicted felon. Live Now look there from New York City to Washington at the White House. The Biden campaign responding this way in a statement by the communications director, Michael Tyler. He says this, quote, "In New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president." So wanted to make sure we got that in back out live there to the White House as well. What we want to do right now, though, is play for you the press conference that just wrapped up by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, taking a victory lap of sorts with his team of prosecutors who secured this conviction today. Let's watch.
Good evening. First and foremost, I want to thank the jury for its service. Jurors perform a fundamental civic duty. Their service is literally the cornerstone of our judicial system. We should all be thankful for the careful attention that this jury paid to the evidence and the law and their time and commitment over these past several weeks. 12 everyday New Yorkers, and of course, our alternates, heard testimony from 22 witnesses, including former and current employees of the defendant, media executives, book publishers, custodians of records, and others. They reviewed call logs, text messages, and emails. They heard recordings. They saw checks and invoices, bank statements, and calendar appointments. This type of white-collar prosecution is core to what we do at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. In the 1930s, District Attorney Thomas Dewey ushered in the era of the modern, independent professional prosecutor. For now nearly 90 years, dedicated professionals in this office have built upon that fine tradition. A major part of our practice during that nearly 90 years has been public integrity work, including cases involving jurists, local and state electeds, public servants, and others. I want to thank this phenomenal prosecution team, embodying the finest traditions of this office: professionalism, integrity, dedication, and service. They are model public servants, and I am proud and humbled to serve side by side with them. The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law, and doing so without fear or favor. I want to conclude by expressing deep gratitude to the NYPD and the officers of the Office of Court Administration for securing the courthouse, all of our safety, making sure the courthouse and all of the other matters that are important in their own right continued seamlessly. They will continue to be and have always been incredible partners. Thank you.
And do you plan to request a prison sentence for this conviction? And do you think that Donald Trump's multiple violations of the gag order that was in place should factor into that request at all?
The judge scheduled a sentencing for July 11th. We will speak in court in that time. He also set a motion schedule. We will speak in our court filings as we've done throughout this proceeding.
Donald Trump has repeatedly targeted you personally and members of your prosecution team. Do you have a response to the former president after this trial is concluded?
I do not.
In February, you decided not to bring a case against Donald Trump. You criticized then. You criticized when you indicted him in March 2023. You criticized when people really started to understand that case. How do you think of all that now, seeing the results of that? Can you kind of put that in context with your personal experience?
I did my job. Our job is to follow the facts and the law without fear or favor. And that's exactly what we did here. And what I feel is just gratitude to work alongside phenomenal public servants who do that each and every day in matters that you all write about and make the press, and in lots of matters that you don't. I did my job. We did our job. Many voices out there. The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken.
Can I ask Mr. Steinglass? Many people said the prosecution was masterful and flawless. Just want to know how you feel at this moment. Sorry.
I'll let you
How do you feel?
Mr. Steinglass, I think some of you probably saw him speak for a little bit the other day. So he's done his job, as has this team. And he just told me, tell him how I feel. I think you said that. I will just say enormous gratitude. You know, our system, I talk about the jurors at the beginning of my remarks. We have a phenomenal system. 12 everyday New Yorkers. They listen to the judge's directions. They follow the evidence. You saw them in court every day. They were careful and attentive. And so I feel deep gratitude to work alongside them, to be a part of this system. And I just want to echo that this is what we're doing every single day. I mean, during this trial, you know, just this week, right, ghost gun indictment, Grimaldi's wage theft plea resolution, sex crimes, convictions, all sorts of work that's being done by phenomenal public servants. So we're before you today on this obviously consequential matter, but this is what we do every day. We follow the facts and the law without fear or favor.
If a jail sentence is in the cards, it is likely that Trump and his attorneys would seek a stay on enforcement of that sentence pending appeal. If that were the scenario, would your office object to staying the sentence?
I'm going to let our words in court speak for themselves when we get to the sentencing matter. I'm not going to address hypotheticals. They raise arguments, we'll respond. And I think your question really underscores an important point. This is an active, ongoing matter, right? We have other phases of this going ahead. We will continue to do our speaking about this matter, about issues like that in court.
All right, last one.
From day one, kind of the viability of this case has been questioned in all sorts of media outlets, all over the place, including from the defendant himself. Can you respond to any of that, how you feel now that you've gotten the conviction?
So my response, again, is I did my job. And I think particularly I talked about the history of the office. You know, my personal history, I started as a prosecutor in 2003 in the Public Integrity Unit in the New York State Attorney General's office. I served also in the Public Integrity Unit in the Southern District of New York. These are kind of cases I've done personally, and it's a hallmark of the tradition of this office that I'm proud to lead. And I don't want to go into the whole body of litigation, you know, but we now have a federal court decision ruling on the legal theories. We had a state court decision on the omnibus motions. But most importantly, today we have the most important voice of all, and that's the voice of the jurors. They have spoken. Donald J. Trump has been convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records. Thank you.
District Attorney, your office has been investigating this case since
Are you concerned about retribution if Trump is elected president?
All right, you heard there from Alvin Bragg, kind of tying a bow on this story. I thought that question was quite interesting on whether or not he's concerned about retribution should former President Donald Trump get reelected in 2024 and what that would look like. Remember, there's been some movement on Capitol Hill at the House Judiciary Committee led by Jim Jordan, the Republican of Ohio, to subpoena Bragg and his office for information about whether or not any federal funds were used to carry out this prosecution. So we'll have to see about that. But in the meantime here, we do want to bring into the conversation yet again someone who we have relied on so heavily here, attorney and legal analyst Jeremy Rosenthal. He joins me. Jeremy, thanks for being with us yet again. You're kind of making the circuit alongside us here. But one of the questions there to Alvin Bragg was more kind of a comment rather than a question. They asked whether Bragg agreed with the assessment of the prosecution, that it was one, masterful, and two, flawless. Is that an apt characterization? Would you agree with that?
Look, they got a guilty verdict. That was the goal, and so it's. I'll tell you this much: I'm a criminal defense lawyer. That's what I do. That's what I love to do. Every once in a while, you have to take your hat off to the opponent. In this case, I'll tell you right now, you had what was it was a strategy that worked, and I think it worked very effectively. Their strategy in this case was what you would call a paper cut. It was death by paper cut. What they did was they called witness after witness after witness. They had 22 witnesses in the case, and the first 22 witnesses set up the very last one. Okay. They set up in the first third of their case. What they did was they set up the motive, if you will, for this charge, that the Trump campaign was in disarray, that things were difficult, that they were panicking over the entire issue when it came to the current affair tape, that they saw all of their hopes and dreams kind of dwindling, right? Then they called in the accountants, the money people, the people that were working right alongside with Trump to kind of set up the money trail and to show the control that he had. And then the third part of it, they brought in Michael Cohen. Right. We forget from time to time that we had all these witnesses. We had David Pecker, we had Hope Hicks, who was, I think, very effective. And it was really hard for the Trump team to land square punches on a lot of those witnesses. Okay. And that was during the time when the jury was really formulating their view of the case.
I see.
So from that standpoint, it's pretty effective from the prosecutor.
So, Jeremy, though, in hindsight now, and it's now easy to kind of make these assessments and characterizations, the conventional wisdom was during the witness testimony of Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels that they were completely unreliable, that they were going to not be looked upon favorably by the jury. Does that hold up anymore? I mean, in hindsight, were they pretty credible and pretty reliable? Is the conventional wisdom now wrong on that?
No, I don't think so. I don't think anybody here is going to hire Michael Cohen. I don't think any of those jurors are going to hire Michael Cohen to run their business. And you can go to any media outlet you like, and they'll bash him pretty well, you know, and for good reason. I mean, we've got perjury, we've got bank fraud, we've got wire fraud. What you lacked in the defense, just to be candid, was a theory. Is Michael Cohen doing all this because he's a scumbag, or is he doing it for an ulterior motive? And what is that motive? Is the motive that he's stealing from Trump? Is the motive that he's jealous? Is the motive that he wants revenge against Trump because he feels like he's been shorted time and again? That was the key ingredient that I really kind of feel like maybe the defense was missing here, was that it's not enough that these people are unreliable. And it's not enough that Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen don't have credibility. Okay. You got to answer the $1 million question, not the $100 question. The $1 million question is why? Why is Michael Cohen going off the reservation? And why is he doing this to isolate Trump and keep Trump in the dark? Because that's what would have acquitted Trump.
Okay, so we know that Michael Cohen will be appearing on another network tonight in prime time. We also know that lead Trump defense counsel Todd Blanche will be appearing on the Fox News channel tonight with Jesse Waters. So I'll be interested to see what is said on that for reaction. But you mentioned, lastly, that this was a risk by Bragg and his team. This scheme, creative, novel, I've heard it being referred to as legal jujitsu, of elevating the crime into a felony, a federal felony, by whatever mechanism here. So it was pulled off. You can make that assessment. But what about at the appellate level? If it doesn't turn out to be as creative and novel, and if it fails at the appellate level, will this risk have been worth taking, Jeremy?
I mean, the prosecutors kind of play with monopoly money, which is why they can take the risks that they take. I mean, if they lose, then they're really out nothing. So it's not a loser pays, obviously, situation. So from that standpoint, I mean, for them, it's always justified, and that's one of the frustrations of defending people for a living. I'll tell you, when it comes to these types of risks, that's the danger of bringing a technical charge. The danger is twofold. Number one, that your jury doesn't care enough about it, right? I mean, if you charge somebody with cutting the tag off their mattress and they confess to cutting the tag off their mattress and they said, I'll do it again, you might not get a conviction because who cares about cutting the tag off the mattress? That's the danger in this charge. The other danger is that when you get legally creative as a prosecutor, you open yourself up to attack potentially on appeal. The one issue that has been brought up a lot is the unanimity part of it, which has been fairly well settled in the law, but we don't like jury unanimity issues constitutionally. That's why they are so problematic and they can trigger appeal.
All right, Jeremy Rosenthal, we're going to have to leave it at that. I'm sure we'll be speaking again to kind of follow the fallout from this as well. Jeremy, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
All right, in the meantime here, let's take yet another quick commercial break. I want to put up some of these tweets, social media reaction from so many prominent Republicans and Democrats alike. And you see there J.D. Vance, who's on some of these Veep Stakes shortlists for Trump, Tim Scott, who is also in the Veep Stakes running, Marco Rubio, Chris LaCivita, who is a senior campaign official with the Trump campaign, and so many others, Lauren Boebert from Colorado, our friend S.E. Cupp with the breaking, Vivek Ramaswamy, a former rival of Trump's, now also being possibly considered as a running mate. Linda Schmidt as well from Fox 5. So many there. In the meantime here, let's, like I said, take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll be diving into the political ramifications of this. We are just months away from the conventions. We are just months away from November 5th, 2024, Election Day, to which former President Trump says that is when the real verdict will be rendered. We'll see you in 2 minutes. And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Before we get into some of the political ramifications at play with the Trump guilty verdict, we want to follow some of these other top headlines that we're getting in live, raw, and unfiltered here. So we want to go to the Twin Cities right now, Minneapolis. Take a look at this, a very active scene. Minneapolis police are on this very active scene. Well, this is what we know. Law enforcement sources telling our station there, Fox 9, our friends there, that 2 Minneapolis police officers have been shot and that 2 other people are dead after a gunman opened fire in a neighborhood south of downtown. Sources say one of the officers was critically injured. Minneapolis police have confirmed 2 officers and at least 4 civilians were shot in this situation. So this is a very active scene here. We also have this, another live vantage point. Let's take that at this intersection. Police tape up there. So we're relying on our Fox 9 Minneapolis station for any more updates. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is read in on this as well. He tweeted this. The State Patrol is on the scene in South Minneapolis, assisting local law enforcement. The state of Minnesota stands ready to provide any resources necessary, praying for all the first responders on the ground, working to keep the community safe. So as is customary with all of these breaking news situations, it is quite fluid, and we'll make sure to bring you up to speed once we have more details on this. But very, very scary situation today in Minneapolis there. So I wanted to make sure to get that on the record. Remember, here at Live Now from Fox, we bring you all of these vantage points, these stories, live, raw, and unfiltered. Let's get back, though, to the biggest one of the day, though. We're going to be kind of punctuating and permeating throughout our coverage some of these other top stories that we want to get to, but we do want to focus on the guilty verdict of former President Donald Trump and see how it might impact, if at all, the 2024 presidential election. We're going to do that with Erin Doherty. She joins me with Axios. And Erin, thanks for being with us. I know you've been kind of on the phones, talking to sources from the campaigns and the like here. Let's start with this plain and simple fact. The Biden and the Trump campaigns almost immediately started fundraising off of this news. What does that tell you about the state of the race?
I think that this sort of tells us that both campaigns aren't really changing their strategies too much after the guilty verdict today. Former President Trump repeatedly, as he's been running, through the Republican primary, has sort of used his various legal troubles as a